or flattened to fit more in their bin. This is a huge issue for all Victorian communities, and we strongly believe that the state government has a role to play to find the long-term solution. In the meantime, we will actively monitor the current situation and keep the community updated. I have a question from Parish Charles. Is Mr. Charles here? Mr. Charles, would you like to read your question? Happy for me to read it. Thank you. Council provides services to people living with disabilities through its standalone services and through the provision of services that it operates with private contractors, government services and functions of government. Council speaks about these through its Darebin Access and Inclusion Plan 2015 to 2019. Some of these services include improving accessible transport options and provides a diverse range of accessible services and arts, cultural, sport and recreational activities and events. The first question is, how does Council take measures to achieve tangible positive changes in attitudes about disability as well as structural discrimination and raise community awareness about mental illness, discrimination and abuse? And the second question, thinking about Council's Access Inclusion Plan for a moment and the proposed Royal Commission, how has Council and its councillors met their obligations under the Darebin Access and Inclusion Plan? Thank you for your question, Mr. Charles, and for your interest in the Darebin Access and Inclusion Plan. To answer both your questions, Darebin's Access and Inclusion Plan 2015 to 2019 is a practical whole-of-council strategy that supports Darebin to be a more accessible and inclusive place and remove the barriers experienced by people with a disability. Goal 6 of the Access and Inclusion Plan is for freedom from discrimination into the future, and actions include: firstly, regularly promoting local stories, events and activities to raise awareness of and promote positive messaging about disability. And 2, ensuring the voice of people with a disability from diverse backgrounds are captured through community engagement processes. Current and recent activities by Council include 2 community events celebrating the disability rights movement in December 2018, marking International Day of People with Disabilities and Human Rights Day. Accessible features available at events, for instance, the Darebin Community Kite Festival next month will include a portable changing place, Auslan interpreted events, rest and recharge zone, and low sensory areas. All major performances produced by Darebin include accessible and inclusive programming such as Auslan interpreting, audio described and relaxed performances. Ongoing advice from the Darebin Disability Advisory Committee, workshops for carers to be held in April 2019, construction of Darebin's first changing place in Darebin on Kelvin Grove in Preston, advocacy in relation to the level crossing removal project, accessible tram stops and minimum standards for accessible housing, healing practices exhibition at Bundoora Homestead in March 2019, exploring the relationship between past trauma, mental health and the body, representation and memorialisation. Structure Stuff Darebin in March 2019, an inclusive all abilities evening of fashion, creativity and celebration of self-expression and the power of reusing and recycling. Autism awareness training for council staff in April 2019. Last year, Council was successful in applying for a state government grant to support Darebin sporting clubs to be more inclusive of people with disability. Darebin's customer service team have recently been awarded the Communication Access Symbol from Scope because of their accessible communication. Finally, events, advocacy and information resources throughout the year. Darebin's Access and Inclusion Plan is implemented through actions in the Council Plan Action Plan, other work plans and through regular reporting. In 2019, the current Access and Inclusion Plan will be reviewed in consultation with the community. The next question is from Mr. Clyde Dawes. Is Mr. Dawes here?
Yeah, we're happy for you to read it out, thanks.
I'd love a little break if you'd like to read it, Mr. Dawes. No?
Very confident in your
Thank you, Mr. Dawes. I note that this question was submitted on Friday afternoon, and the question that you have submitted is that Mr. Sanigan is, as we speak, being forcibly detained. by a private security firm employed by the CEO, Sue Wilkinson, without having been granted a fair hearing. You obviously have some preemptive powers to have known that on Friday afternoon, although I debate the premise of the question, and the second part of your question is how much is it costing the ratepayers? Thank you for this question, Mr. Dawes, which I note was actually submitted on Friday. As you are no doubt aware, Mr. Sanigan has been banned from attending council meetings, special council meetings and planning committee meetings for a period of 12 months. This is because of his continued refusal to conduct himself appropriately in these forums. This was a difficult decision and was not taken lightly, but we have an overriding obligation to ensure that both the community attending our meetings and council staff feel safe under workplace safety laws. At no point has Mr. Sanigan been forcibly detained by security guards or council officers, nor have his democratic rights been abused. I reject entirely this part of your statement. In part because Mr. Sanigan's continued refusal to comply with the ban imposed on him, Council has been forced to engage security contractors to ensure the safety of councillors, staff and members of the public at meetings. This costs Council approximately $334.40 per meeting. The next question is from Peter Touragianis. Is Mr. Touragianis here? Mr. Touragianis, I'm going to let you know that I'm going to amend your question because I don't believe the question as submitted is in keeping with the Code of Conduct. Your question essentially is in relation to Darebin Council's Access and Inclusion Plan 2015 to 2019 and relates to how Council supports people living with disabilities who might report matters of abuse at Council services facilities so that they do not become further victims from reporting such abuses. So thank you for your question, Mr. Touragianis. People with disabilities can report concerns or allegations of abuse by contacting the Commonwealth Ombudsman or the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commissioner, calling the National Disability Abuse and Neglect Hotline. This is a free, independent and confidential service for reporting abuse and neglect of people with a disability. Anyone can contact the hotline, including family members, friends, service providers or people with a disability. The hotline works with callers to find appropriate ways of dealing with reports of abuse and neglect of people with a disability. To make a report, contact the hotline on 1800 880 052 or send an email to hotline@workfocus.com. If the concern is about a Darebin Council service or program, then people can address their concern to the relevant General Manager or to the Chief Executive Officer. Finally, if there are concerns about a community member's immediate safety, then the police should be contacted. The second question is why does Council continue to support the YMCA's operation of its Darebin Council facilities and recreation services? In relation to question 2, Darebin Council has contracted both the Northcote Aquatic and Recreation Centre, NARC, and the Darebin Community Sports Stadium to the YMCA to run for the benefit of the community. These contracts are subject to regular reviews and to inform these reviews. Council officers meet regularly with the YMCA to track the progress of the contracts. When an issue regarding the YMCA management of either of these facilities are reported to Council, they are investigated as a matter of course, and the YMCA are asked to respond to these issues raised and to describe the context of any issue and any remediation actions that may need to take place as a result of the investigation. The complainant is then advised of the outcome of any investigations. Council uses the complaints and comments received from community members to learn and improve on our service delivery. That is, the information collected through complaints is used by Council and shared with the YMCA to understand the community and customer experience in the centre. If you weren't able to capture any of those details of how to report, we'd be very happy to provide those to you in writing. Thank you. The next question is from Mr. Coffey. Keith, please come up.
on. Good evening, everyone. As you've read there, on the one I left this morning, I've made a lot of inquiries, several, it was a lot. It's been in writing and verbal to a couple of managers about the maintenance of our street over the last 2 years. I started at about October 17, and over the Christmas period, it was very slow in picking up. I mentioned to the Mayor of the day in February, it started cleaning up a bit. Just wanted to fill you in on a lot of the history. And I was told the street sweeper comes around every 6 weeks. Well, that's a very long 6 weeks at times, because over the Christmas period it was 3 months, because it was making all the leaves were up the street from me were turned to dust. And where am I up to? Sorry to skip around, because there's other things I forgot to put down, but
It's okay, you can move straight to the questions.
Yeah, well, hold on, I've got to make sure that you understand that it's been over 2 years and it's been handled properly, and I've reported it here. I've got a couple of letters in answer saying the weeds are going to get cleaned up, etc. And it's just getting beyond a joke. Now, it was in the last one, this October, I noticed that the stuff was there. I always cleaned it up myself and throw it in the bin, but it gets to be stretching the lacquer band too far. And that's why I got me this angry that I wanted to put this through. I'm not having to go at the workers, because the workers do a good job that are there. But now, and there's one thing I did forget. There is a particular gum tree on the corner of Bam Street that drops big seed bods, or whatever, gum bods, and people are tripping over them. I wish the hell people would come and report it instead of just coming to me, because probably think I'm a whinger, which I am, but anyhow. And that's what I got when with the Bam Street shops and the Latrobe area be cleaned, because you've sent out about the last year or so, you're going to do up Bam Street. Hasn't gone any further, like many of the other things. It counteracts the good things you do. Anyhow, my question is, and that was question one, when will Bam Street and Latrobe area be cleaned and maintained safely as the gum leaf nuts and fallen branches create unsafe walking space? And question two is the lack of maintenance due to the shortage of council on the ground staff in these areas. Because I know one died recently, and a couple, because I'm friendly with a lot of the workers. So that's how I know a lot of things. So I'd like to get an answer. Could I have it in writing too, please?
Yep, sure. Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Coffey. Regarding street and footpath sweeping within Latrobe Ward. There are a total of 21 sweeper zones which make up the Latrobe Ward, and these zones are swept on a 6-weekly cycle. Over the past 2 months, changing weather patterns have resulted in unseasonably heavy leaf fall, which has impacted on the entire municipality. Additional resources have been engaged to assist with the increased requirements for service. The area in question will be inspected within a week to determine if further sweeping is required outside of the scheduled sweeping program. Council officers will be in contact with you following the inspection to provide an update on the sweeping program. I am confident there is enough staff, but I will look further into the service level being provided in the area.
I don't know you've employed another weed killer or whatever you call them.
Yeah. So we'll get back to you with further details. Thank you. The next question is from Anne Laver. Would you like to come up to ask your question?
Good evening, Mayor Rennie and councillors. Hi. My first question was on regarding the Darebin Road traffic management, which I asked last meeting, but I've received a reply from one of the council officers today, and I believe that I'm going to get some sort of response from Vic Road, so I don't think I need to answer that question at the moment. Okay.
Thank you.
The second question is regarding recycling, and it's similar to the other lady's question that was submitted earlier. So I'll just read mine out. Sure. I have long campaigned for better recycling by Darebin Council and the state government, and believed I have been given erroneous advice by both concerning the health of our recycling. With the advent of the closure of SKM, it is clear that the contract Darebin has with this provider does not include sufficient clauses or performance management measures to ensure items are recycled in a timely manner. Now it has been made clear that the waste is not to be recycled and will be sent to landfill, and the community now feel that what is the point of diligently sorting the rubbish and trying to do the right thing? I absolutely understand the high landfill levy charged by the Department of Environment and sympathise with the fact that the $551 million has not been redirected to councils to assist in creating a better waste management program. Rubbish removal is one of Darebin Council's core responsibilities, and its importance should not be downgraded. My question A, what are the Darebin Council's plan in the short term to address this disaster, and when are they going to inform the community? I did, however, see on Facebook just about an hour ago some post, so I guess someone's acted on my question. But I guess that the wider community do not know what to do. I was at the clean-up in Fairfield on Sunday, and everybody was asking me, what's happening about recycling? What do we do? You know, all sorts of people were asking that when we were doing clean-up in Fairfield. So that's my part A of my question. Part B is, what are the council's long-term plan? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions, Ms Laver. And firstly, I apologise that it did take us some time to get back to you on the question that you asked on the 4th of February. In relation to recycling, I think it's fair to say that we share your dismay at the current situation. Council's contract with our provider, SKM, is sound, but with 20 councils affected and 4 recycling centres now temporarily closed, there is no alternative provider who could take our materials. We have considered all our options, as have many councils who are in the same position. Council has informed our community via website and social media, including Facebook posts, and directly via emails and phone inquiries, and that's been going on for several days. We were informed of the closure on the night it occurred and received no notice from the state government or our provider. The closure is temporary. We were first told that the sites may get clearance by the end of last week, but this has not been the case. We are regularly monitoring the situation and still seeking temporary alternatives. However, we hope that SKM will be back online soon. We will keep residents informed. In the long term, as the contract expires in June 2020, Council will establish a new contact and re-tender at that time. We will continue to work with partners in local government and the community to ask the federal and state governments for lasting solutions. We're looking for the federal government and state governments to work together to stem the tide of packaging and waste through changes in policies such as product stewardship, and to ensure there is an obligation to recycle materials when they are purchased. We're also looking for state and federal governments to change the rules of the marketplace to avoid the monopoly or duopoly or offshoring that currently takes place. It's also important for state government to reconsider a container deposit scheme which has been introduced in New South Wales recently. This would remove glass and aluminium from the recycling system and place an obligation on manufacturers to reuse materials. And we think that's where real solutions will be found. So thank you, Ms Laver. The next question is from David Schultz. Is Mr Schultz here? No, as he's not here, I will read his question. Why will it cost $200 to prune a tree myself, and exactly what service is the council providing me that costs $200, or is this just an outside the rate cap revenue raiser? Thank you for your question, Mr Schultz. regarding the proposed cost of the permit to prune or remove a significant tree on private property. The cost of the permit, $200, covers only the costs required to administrate the protection of significant trees in private property by the proposed local law. This local law has been proposed in response to concerns raised by community members about the removal of significant trees on private property and the impact to shade and habitat that these trees provide. The next questions are from Leon Zambikis. Leon is not here, so I will read the question. Point 1. Has Council's peak body, MAV, and associated partners not planned since the 2017 SKM fire, China not taking our rubbish and the climate emergency, plan to coordinate a business plan where Victorian councils jointly invest in creating a plant to coordinate reuse of Darebin's waste without relying on the free market to purchase our waste? If not, are there local and peak body plans to locally deal with our consumerist consumptive waste via local reuse of single-use packaging and containers? And secondly, is Darebin Council on track to be carbon neutral by 2020 as reported in the 2009 policy aims? If not, why not? And by what range is carbon neutrality missed? Will Darebin Council encourage local school children to participate in the 15th of March climate school strike and send a support contingent in climate emergency support? He notes 5.2 of Darebin Community 2020 greenhouse gas reduction target. 5.2.1 community target. Darebin Council endorses a zero net greenhouse gas emissions target for Darebin community by 2020. Achieving zero net emissions involves reducing emissions as much as possible by using energy only when necessary, using it as efficiently as possible and switching to renewables. Any residual emissions are then offset by investment in accredited greenhouse absorption activities such as tree planting or further greenhouse reduction activities outside of Darebin. Thank you for your question, Mr. Zambakis. And here is the answer in a couple of different sections. Some elements of your question have already been answered, but I would like to add that over the past 18 months, Darebin has been working with partners, including the MAV, on a joint response. Darebin's contract with our supplier expires in June 2020. Council will establish a new contract and will re-tender at that time. Council has long urged the state government to look for long-term solutions and will continue to do so, both through the MAV and independently. With only 3 large-scale providers, no market for the recycled material and China's ban on contaminated waste, we are in the middle of a market downturn. It is important to remember that the state government currently has over $551 million sitting in the landfill levy, which could be used to assist councils and communities to find a long-term solution. And part 2 of your question. Council won't send a support contingent of staff to the strike, but some staff members and members of the Climate Emergency Darebin Advisory Committee may attend in their own time as interested individuals. Council is also providing a venue and promoting a public meeting tomorrow on the climate emergency, hosted by one of the groups involved in the strike, the Youth Environment Committee. Thank you for those questions. That brings us to the end of the questions that I've received on notice. Are there any further questions from the gallery? Yes.
Hi, I'm Parish Charles. Thank you for answering my question earlier, Mayor. I was wanting, I haven't formed this question properly, so it'll be a work in progress as it comes out. I'm speaking about the response you provided in regards to Brian Sanahan, and I've been here when he's acted in a manner that's unacceptable for council workplace, and I can confirm that I would support council's ban on him. However, I think there's abuses of process that can be hampered, and I think that Mr. Turrigan just asked a question before, and he's entitled to ask that question where he can participate in the community and through his charter rights, and I think they were disrespected by council. I understand that you've got a code of conduct expectation, you expect a safe workplace, and I brought up Mr. Sanahan as one of those, but you can't abuse process in where a person with disabilities asks for a response from council, and council formed its own opinion whether they should ask for that. This is a place where community gathers and we put questions to council and council provides responses. And I think to be respectful and to show respect to Mr Tooganas, council should have responded for that. I don't want to see any abuses of processes, and I've seen so many abuses of legislature in trying to get questions answered by council. I see that you try and use the borders to escape answering questions. We brought up questions in regards to YMCA, and there were over 70 affected people with disabilities. Some have had extremely bad outcomes where councillors here have
Mr
acted.
Charles, I'm going to ask you just to contain yourself to the question, and I believe the question you've asked is in relation
I asked in regards to the Equal Opportunity Act and the Charter. So I think council has obligations under the Charter and the Equal Opportunity Act. You responded and said what council did with the Disability Action Plan, but you didn't show what your understanding is and how you comply to the EO Act and the Charter and disability rights within Victoria.
Mr Charles, I'll take that as a question in relation to the final part about not demonstrating that understanding.
I'm a bit nervous too.
No, that's okay, and thank you for coming down to pose that question. As the Mayor, I do need to be confident that things that I say and things that I read out are compliant with the Code of Conduct, and particularly that no statements are defamatory or potentially untrue or open to dispute where they may be defamatory, and for that reason wasn't able to read the question. I do believe that in terms of the intent of the question asked by Mr Tooganas that I conveyed that, and we are happy, of course, to get you further responses offline out of this meeting and to follow up. So thank you.
Mayor, do we need an extension of time in relation to question time?
We do, thank you, Councillor Greco.
I'll move that way. Yeah.
For 15 minutes?
For 10 or 15 minute extension of time.
Let's say 15 minutes, thank you. Moved by Councillor Greco, seconded by Councillor Newton. Thank you. Put that to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you, councillors. So there was another question somewhere? Yes. Yes, please come down.
Is that on? Good evening, everyone. My question is about Aldous Gardens in Westgarth.
Could I just get your name, please?
Oh, Rosalind de Winter.
Thank you, Rosalind.
On December the 3rd last year, Anne Laver asked about Aldous Gardens and was assured that mulching and watering would happen within a fortnight. That hasn't happened. My question is, what does maintenance mean? Is there any budget at all to maintain the large trees, the lawn areas with regular, generous mulching and with reseeding? We can imagine it flourishing. Water catchments, passive irrigation, some water-sensitive urban design. Council states a heritage overlay has been applied to the site to ensure the heritage qualities are retained. What could be more heritage in a garden than the trees, which are not currently mulched, not watered, not helped in any way? And I want to understand the duty of care the council has to a heritage garden. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, Ms de Winter. As it wasn't submitted beforehand, I will take that on notice and get information back to you about the plans in that garden. Thank you. Are there further questions? No, there being no further questions, we'll move on to the rest of the business of the agenda. I do believe that you've actually asked 2 questions, which is the amount permitted in the local law. Okay, look, in light of that, and I did provide Mr Charles with some leeway because you're correct, he did actually get a 3rd question in, I'd ask you to come down and ask a question, but to contain it just to the question, please, and not enter into statements.
Thank you for, my name's Peter Turaganis. Thank you for allowing me this chance. You were talking about defamation before, and I just want to understand council's, how you've come to that conclusion from my question that I asked and that you actually amended. Because it wasn't defamation, at no time was there any intent with defamation. And if we're going on about defamation, I don't understand why council would put their name to a deed with no evidence, and which is against my name, defamation. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turaganis. Perhaps defamatory might have been a better word than defamation, and I apologise for that. I'll just point you to the section in our local law that deals with reasons why a question may be disallowed. So a question may be disallowed by the chairperson if the chairperson determines that it relates to a matter outside of the duties, functions or powers of council, is defamatory, indecent, abusive, offensive, irrelevant, trivial or objectionable in language or substance, deals with a subject matter already answered, is aimed at embarrassing a councillor or an officer, or relates to any matter in respect of the council which may close the meeting to the public under section 89.2 of the Act. So I deemed that there were elements of the question that didn't meet with that, and I'm happy to provide you with more details offline if you'd like to know which bits of the question I felt were not appropriate. So thank you. There are no more questions, so we'll move into the rest of the agenda. Yes, Councillor Lawrence.
Madam Mayor, I've just got a question.
Sorry, it's Mayor Rennie, and if you could just turn on your microphone.
Mayor Rennie, I've just got a brief question before we move into the agenda in relation to this piece of paper in front of me. Two questions.
The piece of paper being the...
This page and this page that don't have numbers.
Can this be dealt with out of the meeting, Councillor Lawrence? These are fairly standard pages that are included in all council meetings.
I might deal with it publicly, but...
No, I'm actually going to say I think we've had the agenda for some time. There's been plenty of opportunity for any councillor to raise any issues, so I'm not going to have that question at this point in time. If you want to deal with it offline and then bring it back to a council meeting, if you feel there hasn't been a satisfactory way, then we'll do it in that way. So we'll move on with the agenda.
Some of these questions I've raised for 2 years, but I'll continue on.
Well, I'm not aware of them, and as I say, we've had the council agenda for a week, so I think there's an opportunity and a way to do things which is preferable. So that brings us to petitions.
I'll do it in social media in the break. If that is the...
Sorry, Councillor Lawrence, I've made a ruling, so we'll move on.
I'm obeying the ruling, but I'm just letting...
No, Councillor Lawrence,
yeah.
Okay.
It needs to be with the community.
We're moving into petitions.
Thank you, Mayor.
Councillor Greco.
Mayor, I have three petitions to table that I've been asked to table, and I'll go through them one by one.
Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
the first petition is in relation to residential parking permit scheme, and it reads as follows. We, the undersigned residents of Beauchamp Street, hereby petition Darebin Council to introduce timed parking restrictions in our street. The time and extent of our preferred parking restrictions are 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday to Sunday. This is due to parking. This is due to parking. Can't make out the handwriting. Parking congestion and no parking for residents. There are 16 petitioners, and I move that this be referred to the CEO and that Council receive a report in relation to this petition.
So moved. Thank you, Councillor Greco. A seconder? Councillor Lasserve. All those in favour? And against? That's carried.
Thank you, Mayor. The second petition, again, it's a parking in relation to parking. It's a petition sponsored by Paul Hanna from Reservoir. There are 15 petitioners, and I'll read the petition again. We, the undersigned residents of McLaglen Crescent, hereby petition Darebin Council to introduce timed parking restrictions in our street. The time and extent of our preferred parking restrictions are 4-hour parking between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. Monday to Friday. This is due to rail commuters using street as a car park. And again, I'll move that the petition be received, be referred to the CEO, and that council receive a report on this petition.
So moved. Thank you. Councillor Greco, is there a seconder for that? Councillor Newton, thank you. All those in favour? That's carried.
And the last petition that I've been asked to table is a petition sponsored by Barbara Davies. There's 87 petitioners, and the petition reads as follows in relation to parking again. We, the undersigned residents, visitors and staff of the Rucker Hill Aged Care Facility at 14 to 24 Peel Street, Northcote, petition the City of Darebin to introduce a residential parking permit scheme into our street for the duration of the construction at 26 to 30 Pearl Street, which will result in residents, visitors and staff not being able to find parking near the aged care facility. We propose for the parking restrictions to be for 1 hour, Monday to Friday, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Again, I move that the petition be tabled, be referred to the CEO, and that council receive a report on this petition.
So moved. Seconded by Councillor McCarthy. All those in favour? That motion is carried. Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there any other petitions? No. Thank you. That brings us to urgent business. There is no urgent business, so we'll move on to consideration of reports. Item 8.1, intention to declare a special charge for the Darebin Solar Savers.
Happy to move the recommendation.
Councillor Amir, thank you. And seconded by Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Amir.
So what we have here is the special charge for the Darebin Solar Savers program. So this is the second round of the Solar Savers program. It's one of our flagship programs, putting solar panels on roofs all the way across Darebin, where residents pay back to council slowly over 10 years. It's exciting to see such strong interest in the program. In the first round, I believe we had about 400 or 500 houses involved. This time we've got 237 properties and many more thousands to come. The really great thing about this program is that, of course, there's environmental benefits, and this is very much driven by the climate emergency that we're facing. But also we know that financial insecurity and struggle can happen in households all the way across Darebin, and this is a way for households to reduce their energy costs, make significant savings over the long term. And also it's noted in the report that one of the impacts that we've been seeing is that people can now use their air conditioning during summer, where otherwise they weren't able to because of cost or didn't feel they could because of the carbon emissions. And that is important, particularly for our older or unwell residents. You know, heat stress can be a very serious matter during summer, and so the response to climate change, as we know, is not just about carbon reduction but also supporting our residents to continue to be healthy as we experience climate change. The charge that the residents will receive on their quarterly, added to their quarterly bills with their rates will be quite small. Will be variable for each house, depending on the solar system they'll have on their roof. For each property, there'll be an assessment to make sure that they can maximise the benefit of the solar panels. But in each case, we anticipate that the cost added will be smaller than the financial benefit they'll get from having solar panels on their roofs. I'm really excited that this is rolling out as we imagined and dreamed of, to have solar panels on every roof in Darebin, and now it's happening. This is something that was originally available to low-income households, to pensioners, is now available to every resident in Darebin, including renters, and we're now turning our focus as well to businesses to get a bit closer to that solar panelled covered dream. It's exciting to see the state government is also contributing, making it easier for residents to get solar panels on their roofs, and I look forward to the solar powered Darebin future. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. Councillor Amir has covered this issue really well.
I just wanted to highlight one fact which we have previously stated in this chamber, and I think it's important to keep highlighting it because it is significant when it comes to solar savers, which is that at this stage, based on the current rate of installations and commitments that Council has made in partnership with residents and hopefully soon also business properties, we are now 46% of the way to meeting our target to double solar generation in the city of Darebin by 2021. So that is a fantastic achievement because it is actually one of those measurable outcomes as a result of a program that delivers, as Councillor Amir says, not just emissions reductions but also comfort to people, particularly in periods when they're experiencing heat waves. And we know from not just local data but also national and international data that some of the greatest impacts on human health are in fact as a result of heat waves rather than your more dramatic experiences of extreme weather which we tend to see on the nightly news. So it is the silent killers, it is those things which we often underestimate the power of, which we are taking a direct impact on. And we know that not only our older residents, but now in fact any resident can access solar savers through this scheme and be part of that commitment we've made to double renewable energy generation by 2021 in the city of Darebin. We're already over halfway there, or almost halfway there, and we'll achieve that. We're well and truly on track. So congratulations to all the new solar saver households, and councillors, as you're aware, you can actually see the exact addresses of where people have made those commitments, and it's lovely to see those installations roll out over coming weeks and months.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there any further speakers? No? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is carried. Thank you. That brings us to 8.2 on the agenda.
Mayor, before we move on to 8.2, I just have a few questions in relation to it.
Certainly.
If I can ask. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Look, the first question is, in regards to the recommendations on page 32, just a couple of questions. One is that in regards to point 2E, where it talks about social enterprise grants with a total pool of $40,000, there's no suggestion there or no indication there of the limit of those grants. Does that mean you can apply up to $40,000, or does it mean that you can apply for $3,000 or $15,000? What is the limit in regards to that? And the same applies to point F in regards to celebrating Darebin grants. You know, what the limits are in relation to those particular types of grants.
Thank you for those questions, Councillor Greco. I'll refer those to Ms Henderson or Ms Fraser.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Ms Fraser will respond.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So in relation to the social enterprise grants, we're recommending that, as this is the first time we'll be piloting a program, that we would need to test what the sort of upper limits of the applications would be, and that would be further defined as we establish the eligibility and the detailed program criteria for that, which is scheduled to open in August 2019. In relation to the Celebrating Darebin grants, that program was piloted this year for the first time. There are two different grants in that program, one for community events, which has $3,000 available, and the second for True North events, so community events in Reservoir, where applicants can apply for up to $5,000. We are proposing to retain those upper limits.
Okay, two other really quick questions. One is that...
Councillor Greco, can I just stop you for a second there? I realise that under the local law, you can only ask a question when we have a motion in front of us. So rather than asking your questions now, perhaps...
Well, then I'll move the alternate motion that we have before us. Okay.
So once that's moved, I think at that point, according to the local law, now you're able to answer your questions.
Okay. I apologise for that. I thought it was the other way round in the event
before that we need a seconder for the motion, so... Thank you. So your motion has been seconded by Councillor Lawrence. I apologise for the confusion. You may now ask those questions.
Okay, thank you. Look, I apologise for that. I thought asking questions before we move into... Okay, the other question is that I'm just a bit confused. I was just looking at the numbers, and if you look at page 31, It says that we need an additional $110,000 at 361 cents in order to make this community grants project to implement it. But then when we look at point number 7 in the recommendation, it talks about approving a net of $117,500. $117,500. So I'm just wondering, maybe I'm not understanding it, but there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy between page 1, the previous page, and what we actually passed in the motion.
Thank you for that question, Councillor Greco. Ms Henderson.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Through you, Councillor, you are 100% correct. The incorrect reference is on page 32 in the recommendation, where it says $117,500 in Part 7. It should instead read $110,361, as you picked up. Thank you very much for that, Councillor. Thank you, Mayor.
Look, it's my pleasure. And just a third question that I had, just in the report, in order for completeness, I understand that many submissions were received, and I just wanted to get a sense of who were the submitters and where they came from.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Greco. Once again, Ms Henderson, I'll refer that to you.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, Ms Fraser will respond.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So through you, in relation to the Stage 2 consultation, we received a number of written submissions. Some of them were from groups who are currently receiving grants from one of Council's existing grant programs. So they were groups from our community grants database, some groups who've received our arts partnership initiatives. Of the more detailed submissions, they related to the groups who are currently receiving funding agreements from Council. That included, as outlined on page 6 of the report and page 7, Diverse, which is the Darebin Information and Volunteer Resource Service, Your Community Health, previously known as Darebin Community Health, the Darebin Ethnic Communities Council, the Darebin Community Legal Centre, Reservoir Neighbourhood House, and the Preston Symphony Orchestra.
Okay, thank you. Look, I'll now, if I can, speak to the motion that I've put up. Look, essentially, councillors, my motion covers all the points that are here. It makes a few alterations, just very, very small ones, in relation to point 2A and point 2B. I'll just very quickly talk to those before my time runs out, because I assume that everyone's read the report and is supportive of the review and the changes. So what I'm proposing is that in relation to small grants up to $3,000, that we increase the pool from $100,000 to $150,000. And in relation to medium grants, that we decrease the pool from $225,000 to $175,000 in order to the money for the smaller grants. The reason I'm proposing that, because I believe that smaller organisations always have difficulty in getting grants. Particularly, we've noticed here in this council where small groups, newly arrived groups, that have difficulty in applying and sometimes competing with more expert groups that get money on a year-by-year basis. So therefore, in order to enable those smaller groups to get greater access, a greater opportunity, is that we increase the funding to $150,000 for those small applications. So that's the essence of my amendment, in order to give smaller organisations and smaller groups access to our community grants. Overall terms, just a comment or two about the review. Look, I welcome the review. I'm glad that we're putting in over $100,000 towards our community grant scheme, and also consolidating the community grant scheme, and in a sense simplifying. I remember it was a bit like this many years ago, where we had small, medium, and if you like large, or in relation to large being in regards to the partnership arrangements that we have. I think it's good to move back to that type of formula because it makes it clearer. And also what I think is worthy to note in this particular review is that we're increasing the venue hire from $80,000 to $100,000. It's not actual money, but it actually enables organisations to get access up to $100,000 of venue hire. Not only that, in this, what I really welcome is that we're piloting a free venue hire arrangement. And I'm really looking forward to what that pilot will bring out, because I think that if we can hopefully extend that pilot, because I see a lot of organisations approaching council, and I've been approached by organisations where groups meet, and they don't know where to, groups form, they don't know where to meet, and to have a meeting, sometimes it can cost them a couple of $100, and that just turns them off, and it diminishes participation in democracy. So I commend the report, and I commend the review, and I hope councillors will support my slight alterations.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Lawrence.
Yes, Mayor Rennie. I'd just like to speak in supporting these minor amendments, but I would stress, while these seem like minor amendments, they can actually improve the breadth of the use of the community grants, because we live in an age of very diverse new arrivals. As is mentioned, they don't even know how to get a room because suddenly everything's privatised and suddenly everything's $70 an hour to hire a room. And so establishing a community and meeting up, and I would cite, say, the Nepalese women's event that occurs in the Shire Hall from the grants of space is very important for smaller communities. And those social events and those cultural events are important about creating some kind of continuity as people establish themselves in the community. So both the increase to the smaller groups who have less resources in some ways in terms of loan acquisition and loan acquittal, and also increasing the actual dollars on the hall subsidies and the free halls are going to spread out this grant to thousands and thousands more people. So the multitude of small groups needs to be understood. In my own ward, 24% of the population come from language and cultural groups that are not even in the top 20. Not even in the top 20 of our languages in this city. So that just shows the complexity of Australia, of Darebin, dealing with this. So these minor alterations sound minor, but they'll have an immense impact.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I'd like to speak against the alternate motion. There's a couple of reasons.
There is just a motion, so you're speaking against the motion.
Sorry, to clarify, I'd like to speak against the motion for two reasons. So in the report on page 36, it talks about the feedback that we got when we asked the community about how they felt about small and medium categories. So this is page 36, and what it says is, this was seen as a positive change to make the application process less time-consuming for small grants, and the increased funding cap in the medium category appealing to applicants who had previously felt the $6,000 limit not worth the application process. So I think for that reason I would speak against Councillor Greco's alternatives. And similarly with point 7, where the change is to approve the proposed net from $117,500 to $110,361.
Can I just remind you, that's a correction of an incorrect amount on the previous.
Okay. In that case, then I support that. That's fine. Yep. And that's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor McCarthy.
It's actually just a question, and it arises as a result of Councillor Greco's proposed amendments. If we could just get clarity, because I can't seem to find it in the report, an indication of the number of applications for small grants, the category of up to $3,000 that we tend to get per annum. If we could get an indication of how many on average we'd get per year up to $3,000.
Ms Henderson, can I pass on Ms Fraser in relation to the number of small grant applications?
Through you, Mayor Rennie, we would be able to assess from our current community grants application process that approximately 75% of the grants that we fund are $3,000 or less.
Sorry, if I can just ask a supplementary. I'm actually, if we have the numbers available, the actual number of grants in that category, if we do have that. To give some context to the officers, the proposed change that Councillor Greco has put forward, and I'm just wishing to test the feasibility of it so I can form a view, would increase the number of those small grants from approximately 33 to 50. And what I'm wanting to establish is whether there are, in fact, at least 50 groups that are applying for those grants, in which case there may be an argument in favour of Councillor Greco's proposal. So.
Yep. Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. I'll just give the officers a minute and see if they are able to answer that question.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, apologies, although it may have been in earlier reports, we don't have the number of grant applications granted in this report. We've got the totals and the thresholds. What I would say is that whatever council chooses to do tonight, a review can be conducted in 6 or 12 months and the totals can be adjusted by council for future grants programs if whatever council adopts isn't perfect. So.
Thank you, Ms Henderson. With that answer in mind, are there further speakers?
Just if I can ask whether a review needs to be stipulated in the motion or whether that's implicit.
I believe that's implicit,
yep.
That it is open to us to hold such a review. Councillor Greco, would you like a right of reply?
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I would. Look, just in relation to the change that I'm making, I'm actually being quite conservative of adding another $50,000 to the small grants, because after hearing the numbers tonight where 75%, if I may have misheard, that currently 75% of the grants that we have now go to are less than $3,000. That's 3/4 of the money that's dished out is already going to grants that are less than $3,000. So what I'm doing here is actually trying to bump up the amount of grants that are around the $3,000 mark in order to not exclude in future organisations or unnecessarily pit them against each other to compete for limited funds. Because the way now that we're moving into this structure, before it was open, that anyone you could play. Now, once you hit the $100,000 mark under the previous proposal, there was no more money left to give under that types of grants. So, as Councillor McCarthy said, so we're moving from giving potentially 33 grants of $3,000 to 50 grants of $3,000, and we're only diminishing the up to $15,000 grants from about 15 to about 12. So I think it's a fair adjustment, and again, I think it reinforces the point. I think we need to underline that point, that we make the more vulnerable and smaller organisations, and we've heard this, we've been inundated in the chamber, particularly some of the smaller African groups that apply for the first time and got to get through the whole maze of, and this will make it easier because it'll be less onerous task on them to apply for a smaller grant than applying for a big grant. That doesn't exclude them from applying for big grants, but at least our funding approach is it makes it easier for those types of organisations to get money.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. I'll now put that matter to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is carried. That brings us to item 8.3 on the agenda. Councillor McCarthy, thank you. Moved by Councillor McCarthy, seconded by...
I have an amendment.
Sorry, I can't take an amendment until I've got a seconder. So, Councillor Amir. So it's moved by Councillor McCarthy, seconded by Councillor Amir.
Can I hear the amendment, Mayor, before I speak?
No, we'll have, I believe, I take speakers first. Yep. So, Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor, and I look forward to hearing Councillor Williams' amendment. This this is actually a pretty difficult report to have to consider, because one of the frustrating things when we talk about an issue like homelessness is not only sometimes what we might consider the limits to local government powers, the things we would like to do, which we don't necessarily always have the resources or power to do, but also the complexity of the issue. And I just wanted to draw, before I delve into the report and highlight the proposed course of action, I would like to highlight one factor which I think is quite stark in relation to this matter of homelessness, which is that Darebin has been identified as one of the municipalities with one of the highest rates of homelessness in Melbourne and, in fact, in Australia. And there is a factor around this which I think is really important for councillors to understand, which is that about 1 in 4 people that are considered homeless in both the Victorian and I believe also the Darebin context are young people between the ages of 12 and 24. Those young people become homeless for a whole range of reasons. The number one factor of homelessness, of course, is family violence. About 46% of people who are homeless report that. And these are not necessarily young people that you may see out on the street, although there is some rough sleeping. They are often couch surfing, they are squatting, they are staying and surviving in a whole range of environments. So we have a role, as does every government in the country, to take action on this issue. And to identify what we can do. And there are, of course, a proposed series of actions in this particular report that suggests how we might go forward. I also think it's worth noting, and I'm not going to go through the recommendations one by one, but I think it's also worth noting the enormity of work that takes place in our community, often without reward, often without recognition, by community organisations, which council in many cases has a direct relationship with. And they're outlined in this report, and that's really what this report does, is give you a snapshot of some of the activity that's taking place and how it fits together. So I want to honour those organisations and those volunteers and individuals who make a tangible and practical difference every day to this issue. I want to just draw councillors' attention to some of the pieces of action here, and particularly the proposal to make a submission into the Royal Commission into Mental Health, because there is no question about the intersection between mental health and homelessness and the failure, the abject failure of our health system to actually, and the funding for it, to actually provide prevention rather than reaction. I also want to note as well that coming up in March is the first in, I think, 26 years, National Youth Homelessness Conference, which is being held at the City of Melbourne, and I would encourage councillors and members of the public to go along and engage in that. I support the recommendations, but I look forward to hearing Councillor Williams' amendment.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Amir.
Homelessness is a problem that keeps getting more and more challenging. The demand for housing keeps going up, and as the cost of living rises, it gets more and more difficult. One thing that really struck me with this report is the number and breadth of organisations that are contributing to supporting homeless people in Darebin. So we have organisations providing food, legal advice, material aid, housing in some cases. There's 29 organisations listed, but there are still big gaps in what people need. And the most obvious one is in housing provision, which largely falls to the responsibility of the state government and, of course, the federal government with the levers they can pull to make housing more affordable. Please do that now, please. But in terms of council supports, it'd be interesting to explore a bit further what more could be done. So some of the things raised here are around gaps in accessing food. So we know there's various community lunches around the places, but perhaps it's a bit more difficult to access on weekends and evenings. From speaking to people in the community who are homeless, they have told me that sometimes it can be hard to find somewhere to charge their phone, especially if the library's closed, because often the library is where they can go. It can be hard to find somewhere to have a shower or to keep their things safe. And something else that comes to mind is to look at what more we can do to prevent homelessness happening in the first place. So those are things around reducing the incidence of family violence, supporting young people, supporting families to be inclusive, and cases where people might be working really, really hard to pay rent and sometimes just can't, and if they can't make the repayments, then become very much at risk. So I look forward to this just being the beginning of the work we're doing in this space.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor Williams, did you have an amendment?
Yes, I do. I actually brought this notice of motion some months back where I actually asked to, as you see under number C, identifies opportunities to improve service positions, including opportunities to improve access to council services and facilities. So in my amendment, I'd like to ask to have an urgent report outlining housing homelessness action plan using our existing structure and services to give temporary accommodation, showers and material relief.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Councillor McCarthy, Councillor Lawrence, I'll get you to sit down because the first question I have is whether that's accepted as an amendment by the mover.
I have no problem with the merits of it. I'm just not sure on the wording. If I could just get some clarity on the wording there.
I think it's a yes or a no, but is,
well,
what
the
can
current
you?
wording is, if I'm correct in reading it, an urgent report outlining housing homelessness action plan.
An urgent report to come back to council.
Is it an urgent report outlining a housing homeless or an housing homeless action plan? Is that? I'm just trying to make sense of what it's asking us for. It's asking us for an action plan.
And
if we can just have that amended, and then I'm happy to accept it. So.
Okay. I'll just check that Councillor Williams, that reflects the amendment you wanted to put. It's accepted by the mover. Is that accepted by the seconder? Thank you. That becomes the substantive motion. Are there further speakers on this motion?
Can I speak?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, we do need an emergency relief for our homeless sleeping on our streets, living in cars and rooming houses and couch surfing, which is going to face another terrible -degree temperatures during our winter period, which is only a few months away. The ABS census reported on data that was filled out only on the night, which only includes people who had permanent addresses, but it's more actually estimated that over 1,500 people were homeless that night. So many women and children fear for their life that they feel living on the street or in a car is a safer option. Council can look at temporary housing and open our temporary buildings, like our halls, to give shelter. We can open our council buildings, sporting facilities and swimming centres for an extra hour that closes at 6 p.m. to allow homeless people to freshen up with a hot shower, shave and wash their hair. This council has a wonderful relationship with people like neighbourhood houses, churches, diverse, safe haven. Salvation Army, to name a few, that actually provide clothing, food relief, but only 2 offer showers or a laundry. We talk about climate emergency at this council, which is in the forefront of taking action in this particular area. But what about the emergency of those that are facing homelessness? This council can also be in the forefront, just like climate change, and make a difference to the most disadvantaged amongst our community.
Thank you, Councillor Williams, and I'll just draw your attention to the words as they now appear to make sure that they have been accurately captured. So it would be an urgent report outlining a housing and homelessness action plan. Is that... It's just to make sure that the small words are in the right spot. I think that's what you intended, but... Okay, I'll just check that that's okay with Councillor McCarthy and Councillor Amir. Sorry. Yep. Okay, thank you. So an urgent report outlining a homelessness action plan using our existing structure and services. Thank you.
Urgent report to come back to council. So it needs to come back.
Yeah. So still acceptable with to come back to council?
That's fine, and I think there's also a comma after accommodation, if I'm correct, as well.
Okay.
I just want to be clear on what we're asking for so we get the right thing.
Okay. Thank you. And acceptable to the seconder? Thank you. Councillor Lawrence.
I'd like to move a further amendment.
Yes. What would the amendment be?
The amendment would be an additional point 8, that council review its processes in regard to rooming house compliance actions and the impact on homelessness in our city.
I'll just wait for that to be typed up. Thank you. Yep. Yeah. We'll just wait before I get the mover and seconder to reflect on that. Thank you. Without commenting on grammar or spelling, is that okay?
That's
yep.
The intent's quite clear, and happy to incorporate that.
Okay. And Councillor Amir? Okay, so we will take out the apostrophe, thank you. And so we've got an apostrophe that we don't like. And Councillor Lawrence, is that as you intended with your...
Yes.
Thank you. So is that acceptable to the mover?
That's acceptable once the words "that council" is removed from the sentence, just so it's clear.
Okay, so we don't need that, council. We can just have review its homeless, its processes in regard to rooming house compliance. And Councillor Amir? Yes. Okay, that becomes the substantive motion. Councillor Lawrence, would you like to speak to it?
Yes, thank you.
Speak to the motion.
Madam Mayor.
Yeah, speak to the whole motion. Yep.
I'll just briefly speak to the whole motion and the point 8. Obviously, very commendable motion from Councillor Williams in that we do have resources that can provide extra crisis relief that is required because of so many forms of homelessness occurring, including access to showers and things. And this is obviously goes on in other cities. My point I've just added because it... I probably should declare a conflict of interest, but last June, this council took action that left me homeless and evicted. And so I have a first up close look at what rooming house life is like in Reservoir. And it's not an issue I'm unfamiliar with because I've been into illegal rooming houses many times in this city. And previously we had a practice of having the social inclusion unit reach out to the tenants inside those rooming houses before the enforcement laws are brought to bear, which in previous occasions was less than $300 fines for the operators and homelessness for the residents. For instance, if you have 8 residents, 2 are going to be homeless. We should be having social inclusion unit work with those people prior to enforcement. In fact, we had, in my case, a council officer insisting that there was only 2 residents where there was, in fact, 7 or 9 across 2 buildings in a house. And because of arbitrary interpretation of regulations, a number of people were faced with illegal evictions, which were actually groundless evictions. I could, talk to you for 1 or 2 hours about it now because...
Unfortunately, Councillor Lawrence, you have 10 seconds.
I've got 10 seconds, but... I thank the council for causing my eviction. I resisted it for 6 months through legal means.
That's time.
And we don't need to be making people homeless.
Thank you for that. Are there any further speakers?
Yes, I'd like to speak in relation to the motion as it's been amended, or the motion now, the substantive motion. Look, I think it's good that we're receiving some information and some reports in relation to this issue. I think it's quite staggering for us to learn that it's at least or around 1,500 people who are sleeping rough in our city. I don't think many people in our city would actually know that or will be aware that the figure could be as high as that, if not higher. So it's quite welcoming to see the reports coming back to council. I also welcome the changes that have been put in place, particularly Councillor Williams' change, because when I was when I just was reading this just now again, if you look at point C in Councillor Williams's original motion that instigated this report, it refers to identifying opportunities and to like practical things. But when we look at the recommendation from 1 to 6, whilst it's all good intended there about submissions to various bodies and things like that, but there's nothing really practical or what we could do as a council. So I welcome those 2 additional points where we can actually do things that are within our control or within our means to actually put things in place. I know, for example, homelessness has been a big issue for the City of Melbourne. You know, the City of Melbourne did not sit on their hands and sort of just write submissions and talk to various other parties and things like that, but they actually try to do some practical stuff. People could say whether they achieved their ends or not, but they actually had to try and develop some practical initiatives that could help the homeless. I think we have a lot of dormant resources in our city. We mentioned the swimming pools. There's also the sporting clubs that have shower facilities and all sorts of activities. And that I think if we can harness those things, we can make life for the homeless in our city a little bit more bearable.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Are there any further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is carried. That brings us to item 8.4 on the agenda, the 2018-19 Quarter 2 report, including.
Happy to move.
Councillor Amir, seconded. Councillor McCarthy.
I have some questions before we move on, if that's okay.
Yes, certainly.
Just a couple of questions in relation to this report. I've noticed that in the report, if you go into the body of the report, particularly the financial reporting, there are many capital works projects that basically say that. I'm just trying to locate the page. Excuse me, councillors. That basically say that that we are spending less than the in terms of the adjustments. It's actually less than what's been budgeted for. There are quite a few of those entries. If you look at page 153 in the council report, where, for example, if you look at our bridges or our drainage or our parks and open space, where we're spending less than what we budgeted for. So I suppose what my question is, when we're doing the budget estimates, are the budget estimates rigorous enough? That's one question. And I think that's an important question, given that we're about to go through a budget process. We need to have some surety that the budget estimates are rigorous. And then the other point is that given that it's less than what we budgeted for, what the consequence of that is in relation to the particular projects, because the notes are not explanatory enough to give us some insights or give the community insights in regards to these figures that are before us.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. I'll refer those questions to Mr Cochrane.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So there's a number of projects there which are showing forecast savings. So the budget estimates which are put together go through a quantity surveyor to get good estimates, but they do make an allowance for latent conditions, particularly where we're looking at things like drainage. And you will note that while we've got some savings on some of those drainage projects, the savings from that drainage projects has been reallocated to a different drainage project. So we've had some savings in one drainage project, but reallocation to another drainage project. There are some projects there which have dependencies on other projects finishing, and I'll draw your attention perhaps to the Robinson Cap Master Plan implementation, where that's relying on the completion of the WH Robinson Pavilion to be completed, and your council would be aware that the initial contractor there went bankrupt, and we've had a resolution in this chamber to amend that contract. Some of the other programs is where there has been a change in scope. So with the plant replacement, where we've got to order garbage trucks, they will now be delivered in next year's program because there's of the long lead time for those garbage trucks. So many of the changes relate not so much to the cost estimates, but rather to other conditions which have arisen. I could probably go through most of them and explain those, if there's one in particular.
Thank you, Mr. Cochrane.
I just have one more supplementary question. Just on page 150, under materials and services, about major variances, the first dot point there, and as you all know, I've got a passionate interest in age and disability services, and it says that age and disability is $185,000 less than the budget, and it is forecast that this variance will be $392,000 at the end of the financial year. So I suppose my question there is that are we diminishing our aged care services as a council on the basis of these figures?
I'm not sure who'd rather take that question, Ms Henderson or Mr Cochrane. Ms Henderson.
Through you, Mayor Rennie. So as councillors are aware, we have a trend of declining service hours, which for many of our services has slowed that decline, which is good news, but there still is a degree of decline, and that's why at the moment there's a projection that we won't meet the budgeted figure for how many service hours we'll produce. That's despite the fact that we welcome new clients, but as you know, the impact of the My Aged Care system has meant that there's a limit on how much service we can provide to people, and there are fewer circumstances in which people are referred to us.
Thank you.
Supplementary to that, I suppose my question therefore really was getting at if there is a diminishing of the service, what are we doing to arrest that diminishing service? Are we putting into place strategies to get the service up or not?
Ms Henderson.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, the current review that's being conducted, which is the Age Friendly Darebin review, is looking at the whole future of services for aged care in Darebin, and that will be looking at those issues definitely. It's not like other services that council runs where we can advertise directly to citizens and citizens can just access our services. They have to be referred through My Aged Care to our services, and that makes it different to many other things, unfortunately.
Thank you. Now we're back at the progress report, the motion. So we had some... Councillor Amir, would you like to speak to the motion?
So we're required to have a quarterly report on our financial performance and actions against the action plan. Firstly, I want to say thank you to all the staff across all teams for your hard work in all the work that's happened in the last 3 months. Some of the highlights for myself and also listening to the report were the 18,000 square metres of footpaths renewed, 500 new trees and shrubs planted along Mary Creek, the retention of the old Ruthven school site as a natural park, the new Cloud e-library, including ebooks in many different languages, and some of my things I'm particularly proud of are the development of the open space strategy that's happened, the win around the level crossing removal, the completion of the Dundas Street Bridge, which I enjoy cycling over many times a week, and our really solid service delivery in a whole lot of areas that probably don't get noticed because everything just goes so smoothly and there's no reason to think it would ever be otherwise. One of the areas that comes to mind are our immunisation rates, which are among the highest in the state, which I'm very proud of, as well as some of the newer initiatives that are coming in, such as the Reseal program using 99% recycled content. So over 1,000 staff did a lot of work to get these results in terms of the services delivered to the community, the capital works. We're in a good financial position. There's an operating surplus of nearly $68 million, accounting for capital and other items. Net current asset position, $131 million, and 82% of the capital projects are on track. So as has been noted, there's a few projects that have fallen behind. There's been a couple of unexpected expenses, such as the works done at Gellibrand Kindergarten that I understand was a challenging time, and everyone did an amazing job pulling together, both staff, community, parents, and thank you for that. The report here outlines the work that's happened across our 16 big actions, capital works, delivery against our goals. I think this is the prettiest report of this kind I've seen since being on council. So it's really good that it's so accessible for the community to be able to read and look at. And as many people know, we pride ourselves on transparency, and having reports like this that are easy to read, have all the numbers laid out, have everything mapped against the actions is one way that we can do that. So thanks very much to everyone for a successful quarter.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'd second Councillor Amir's commendation to the officers for their work in bringing this together. I'd just like to highlight some of the items, not only in the resolution but also in the report, that some good news stories and some achievements in the last quarter. One, of course, that's proposed tonight is to establish a property reserve, so that when council sees fit to sell a piece of land, that actually goes into a property reserve which can only be used for the purchase of other land by council. And this is an important factor in play, because it means that we can start to build up a sum of funds which are dedicated towards securing particular parcels of land that are of strategic or important community value. And we've had a number of occasions when we've had to do that in the past, and it's important that that money is there for that purpose rather than just going into consolidated revenue. So if you sell some land, you have a pot of money that makes it available to buy some other land when the time is right. I also want to highlight some of the achievements under the council plan, action plan for the past quarter. Significantly, approximately 18,000 square metres of footpath was renewed as part of our footpath renewal program, and we know how important that is in terms of accessibility in the city and making it easier for people, particularly in the range of abilities to get around and to get around safely. A whopping 500 trees and shrubs were planted along Merry Creek, and while we know that the rainfall effects can sometimes have impact on our planting, there is a persistence between us and Merry Creek Management Committee to have a real impact there. And of course, an issue close to my heart, along with Councillor Amir, is the not only the great immunisation rates, but also the great participation rates in maternal child health service by Aboriginal
10 seconds.
community, which has grown from 73% to almost 80%, which is an enormous achievement for a change within 12 months. And it's a really important factor for our community. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
Mayor Rennie, I've got a question.
Yes? I'll get you to stand up if you could.
Yep. Just got a question in relation to the 6 action plans, and forgive me because obviously I've been a bit patchy on my attendance to issues. But in 2016, Council passed a motion to create a community housing trust, and that doesn't seem to be in the top 16 actions. So what happened to that housing trust?
I'll refer that to one of the officers, but I don't believe our motion actually said that we would create a housing trust. It was to explore that, and we were looking here at the council plan, which was developed and passed by council, and these were the 16 actions here are the 16 actions that were agreed to by council when it passed this council plan. So I think that the motion you're referring to actually falls outside of the council plan and was investigated with a number of follow-up meetings.
So my recollection is...
I'm more interested in a question if you have a question, and less interested in
What
recollections.
happened to it, because my response verbally was it was referred to some kind of subcommittee or something 2 years ago. Obviously, you know, housing may be in the community's mind in the top 16 issues, but anyway.
Okay. Thank you. I'll refer that. Yes. Yeah. What happened to that motion? I'll refer that to Ms. Olivier. Are you in a position to give a response to that now?
Mayor Rennie, look, I don't think I can do it justice right now, so I would like to take that on notice. I do know there's been a lot of work towards that since then, but I'd like to sort of do the detail and come back.
Okay, thank you. Are there further speakers to this motion? Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor. I actually have an amendment that I'd like to propose.
Sure.
The amendment should be coming up soon. It was distributed earlier this afternoon. I'll give councillors the opportunity to reread it and hopefully find a seconder for it.
Is that acceptable to the mover?
I have many questions.
You can just say no and then it can be debated. Thank you. Therefore, we'll go to debate on that amendment. We need a seconder for the amendment. Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, and thank you, Councillor Lawrence, for seconding this amendment to the substantive, to the motion that's before us. Look, it was mentioned that the establishment of a property reserve. In principle, I don't have anything against establishing a property reserve, but I believe that if we are to establish a property reserve, that we would need to fund that reserve from accumulated surpluses. In the same way that we're funding information technology reserve from accumulated surpluses, we should be funding the property reserve from accumulated surpluses. And this swapping exercise, or selling assets or selling property to potentially, mind you, to potentially buy other property, for me it's not on. I think that this council needs to make a principled decision here that it will not privatise its council property. We live in a council, a municipality, which is, if you like, landlocked in the sense that we can't grow any further. The properties that we have here, we can't recreate. So we should not be selling willy-nilly properties and then saying that then we can use those properties, the revenue from those properties, to purchase other properties. Because the way that it's worded now, the substantive motion, is that that the reserve, that the funds will go towards the proceeds will go towards the reserve, and then, except by council resolution, the funds for this reserve are only to be used for the purchase of real property, except by council resolution. So there's no hard and fast rule about how much property, a one-to-one swap, how much property we do sell, how much property we do buy when we do sell property. So it's very nebulous to me in terms of the wording that we have here that can lead us down the slippery path of privatising publicly or council-owned properties and then not substituting them with not using the revenue.
Can I just check what's happened to our time?
Well,
sorry,
I'm
Councillor Greco.
So there we go. I've got 2 minutes. Thanks for the warning. So I'll just take it.
I think you got lucky, but yeah.
So here the essential question here, councillors, is that by voting for my amendment, we are saying no to privatisation of council property. If you don't vote for my amendment, councillors, we are opening the floodgates, the possible floodgates, to privatisation of council property. So, councillors, the call is on you that we have to make a principled stand, and I think we all belong to political parties or in terms of our own individual beliefs, that we are generally, I would say, most of us around the table, against privatisation. Let's state that. People have raised with me, but what about if we want to sell a lane at the back of a property? Well, that could be looked at. That's not an issue. But what I'm suggesting here is a wholesale sale of council real property. Let's make a statement and say no to privatisation.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Now, can I just draw your attention to the words on the screen, because it took a while, I think, for the officers to get them right, but before we go on, I would like to make sure that this is... I believe it is the amendment that you wish to put forward, but can I just have confirmation from you? Yeah. 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 So, Councillor Greco, in the amendment as you put forward, it had left out endorses the establishment of a property reserve, because you just talked about replacing A, B and C with A to D. So, yeah, okay, that's correct. Thank you.
Thanks for picking that up.
No, that's good. Councillor Lawrence. Oh, yeah, we've had a seconder for this amendment, so everyone will have an opportunity to debate this amendment, but Councillor Lawrence, you seconded the amendment. It's now over to you too.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Obviously, you know, again, I underscore my alarm that this council hasn't been able to put housing and create the kind of housing trust that Port Phillip Council had, which we've had 2 years to do, which could be a beneficiary of these types of reserves. I will note we have created a nature trust committee that I voted for and supported 100%, which could be the final destination of some of this money. However, I rise to support the amendment and the amended motion with Councillor Greco, because this community has been ravaged by privatisation of the Education Department, the roads and everyone time and time again. Land is scarce. We also have airspace because we have 6-storey zones on a lot of land. And we needed to, as a community, say stop the privatisation, stop the Jeff Kennetisation of this community. All the land we have should be used for open space as it is, can be transferred even to not-for-profit housing, can solve the housing crisis in this city. But once we go down the path of the highest bidder, we are privatising land that we will never get back. Now, we've seen it with the schools. We shouldn't engage in it. We've opposed it with the schools. We've opposed it down at Merry Parade. We've opposed it wherever it's come up. We've had other councillors in other places play Monopoly next door in City of Banyule, and they can show a cash, but they burnt down a basketball court in the process and denied the community access to existing resources for a decade. This shonkiness has to stop, and I'm shocked that a standard reporting of a quarterly plan actually has a very dangerous proposition here that has no safeguards and no transparency about what we're voting for.
Time. Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. I'll get you to take your seat, please. Councillor Surf has a question, yes.
I would just like to ask the effect of 3A. Has Councillor Greco raised the sale of laneways? What effect would 3A have on the work currently performed by officers, particularly in cases that they're currently dealing with? Would it cease work? Would 3A mean that we would stop all work on the proposed sale of laneways?
I'll ask for a response.
Through you, Mayor Rennie. So there could be some circumstances where council might want to consider the sale of property to private organisations or private persons. We're actually developing a property management framework that will include criteria that guide the sale of property. We'll be discussing these criteria with councillors as part of the development of the framework, and that may be a way in which councillors could consider, I guess, the broader principles underlying property sales.
Thank you for that answer. Further speakers. Councillor McCarthy.
I've got another question. I'm just absolutely perplexed by what this means, so I need some guidance here. If I'm correct, 3A says that council will not sell any lands that it owns. Is that correct? That's my reading of what that means.
My interpretation of what it means is that it means no sales of property to private organisations or persons.
So if I'm correct in understanding from that answer, 3A, and I just seek rock solid clarification, means that council could not sell or dispose of a laneway as we currently do, which is of no longer value to council, but is in fact of value to those neighbouring residents.
Ms Bishop.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. If I could respond to that. So what 3A does is actually restrict us basically from selling property. So that's why I think this is a really great conversation, and I think it needs to be in context of the property management strategy and the framework, so that we can establish with council what your principles are in relation to disposal of property. So when it comes down to right-of-ways discontinuance, obviously we would want to continue so that we can allow ratepayers to purchase those plots of land that we have no use for, and it's obviously making an extreme value and benefit to them. Council would know that recent sales of property have been to the private sector, and that is...
Councillor Bishop, I think you might have entered debate, and I think you've answered the question.
I was just trying to explain that what I'm really recommending, councillors, is this is a great conversation. It warrants the conversation having in the briefing.
Thank you. Any further speakers?
I've got another question, sorry, Mayor, and it's going to point B, which is that there is a reference to council's accumulated surplus. Can I just get some clarity here? Would that be basically council tapping into an existing surplus or the surplus at the end of the year? What is officers' understanding of that reference there, what that actually means?
Mr Cochrane, can I have an answer from you, please?
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I'll put it in the context of what currently happens and why we're proposing the Property Development Reserve. Is currently all proceeds from sales from laneways goes to the accumulated surplus. But there is no identification of how much of that accumulated surplus is related to the sale of property. This reserve would then enable a simple mechanism to be able to capture how much of essentially the accumulated surplus relates to the sale of property, and therefore make an easy mechanism for being able to determine a source of funds for future property purchases.
Thank you, Mr Cochrane.
I have one more question, sorry, Mayor, because there are multiple points, and thank you, Mr Cochrane. At the moment, as I understand it, this chamber needs to make a decision in relation to the sale of any land or property owned by council. Can I just get clarification that applies to any land by council needs to be, if it's to be sold even to a resident, needs to come through this chamber?
That's correct.
In that case, Mayor, I'd like to speak against the amendment.
Thank you. Councillor McCarthy.
Could I seek a clarification to the question that was asked and the answer that was given?
Okay. Yes.
I need a further clarification in relation to the question that was asked by Councillor McCarthy and that the answer that was given,
so the
to give it a little bit more context.
Would any sale of any property always come to council? And the answer was yes. Any sale of any council property would always be a matter that came to council. Under the substantive? No, as the situation currently is, the sale of any land owned by council would always be a matter that would come to council. It would never be something that occurred under delegation. Yep. Does that clarify that?
And therefore, what is the consequence of that? In terms of my motion, does that mean that any sale of land or that any potential sale of land does not come to the council? That we don't sell. That we don't sell land.
Your motion would mean that we don't sell land.
Okay. Yep. Be clear about that.
And that would be we don't sell laneways, noting that we have 2 on the agenda further on. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mayor. I think I've got 2 minutes or 3 minutes?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. I'm going to speak against this for several reasons. The first being that it is effectively almost out of order, point A, 3A, because it is unenforceable. It is effectively saying that council will not consider the sale of any land, including laneways. We know that that is actually a practice that occurs in this council. This motion is not, and I take great offence to the imputation that's been made by speakers in favour of this amendment, that by supporting the creation of a property reserve, that is analogous to going on a selling spree of council land. That is frankly ridiculous. As Mr Cochrane, the Chief Financial Officer, pointed out very clearly, this is simply about having a mechanism so when council does sell a laneway or does sell any other property that owns, and sometimes council owns land that it shouldn't have owned. In fact, it is historical quirk that money does not just go into the accumulated surplus, but in fact is actually retained for the purposes of purchasing land that is of real value to our community. So this is not a policy to sell land. Council already sells land. This is about securing the funds from any sale in a reserve so that it doesn't just get swallowed up in the annual figures. So if councillors want to try to turn this, what is a financial mechanism, effectively like opening a bank account, into a policy issue, by all means go for it. Take your fight out into social media, but you are misrepresenting what we are actually talking about here, which is about ensuring that when we sell a piece of land, it doesn't just end up in the cash surplus for the year, but it in fact is put towards community benefit. And 3A is frankly ridiculous.
10 seconds.
Because it goes completely against the very practices that councillors in this chamber vote for on a constant basis.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there any further speakers?
Is it possible?
Sorry, if you have a question.
Is it possible to do an amendment to we exempt laneways?
No, we can't amend an amendment, so.
Okay.
So, any further speakers? Councillor Amir.
While I absolutely support the values of retaining public land, and this is something that we've spoken about many times in this chamber, both in their formal meetings and also in briefings and conversations with each other around how we can better protect public assets for public use, including many discussions I know that our officers have had with the Department of Education, with Melbourne Water, with VicTrax. In a couple of times we've fought pretty hard to try to retain land, one example being Preston High School, another example being the purchase of Rona Street from Melbourne Water. There's other conversations with the community around land in the region area. And what is proposed around creating this fund is an opportunity for us to be able to do more of that work in purchasing land for the community. If we have these patches of land that are in people's backyards or laneways that are currently only being used by one family, then that is not in the public interest when that money could then be used to purchase land that can be used by everyone in the community. And we know that there are not enough parks in some of the areas. I'm sure, like we purchased Rona Street 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, there's going to be a lot more Rona Streets coming up. And so we do need to separate out money to make sure we have enough. As density increases more and more and more, we need to make sure that we have a plan. And I'm not sure that doing it this way is the most strategic way to go around the end goal, which I think we all have, which is maximum public land for maximum community benefit. I absolutely would support a motion to stop the Jeff Kennetisation of Darebin, but I don't think that what we've got here is that.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Are there further speakers? Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I'd like to speak against the motion, in particular 3A. So council will not endorse the privatisation of any real property owned by council. I think it's clear from the answers given by our officers that to vote for this would be irresponsible for any councillor. what it would mean. I think using road discontinuances is a really good example for why we shouldn't vote for this, because basically that's a piece of land that's often been used by a householder for years and years and years, hasn't been used as a road for decades in some cases, which we're selling to the property owner that often has used it for decades. So to put forward something that says that we can't do that anymore is incredibly irresponsible.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Councillor Le Cerf, did you want to speak?
I just had a further follow-up question about the property management framework and when we're expected to see that and whether it would come to council for endorsement.
Through you, Mayor Rennie. It's a project that we're commencing this financial year and it will definitely come to council this calendar year, so probably around September. Certainly for discussion, yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just have one follow-up question. If we were not to establish the property reserve, could you provide an estimate between now and the time that the framework comes to council of the lost money that would go into that reserve? I know that's a hard question because I guess it's depending on the laneways that come to us for sale.
Can I get Mr. Cochrane to answer that question?
Through you, Mayor, I'll wait for advice on the amount of money, but in fact, the purpose of this recommendation, not the motion, but the purpose of the recommendation was around structure and transparency. In fact, it is possible for council to consider not establishing the reserve at all tonight and waiting for the framework to come forward and having that be part of an integrated consideration. So that would also be an option. I'm hoping Mr. Cochrane can answer the amount of money question.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Rennie. So it's forecast the amount of money coming into the reserve this year would be 1.957 million. There is a purchase pending, which would be funded out of that reserve.
Thank you, Mr. Cochrane. Are there any further speakers? I believe you've spoken, Councillor Lyons.
A question.
Yes, stand up and...
Mayor Rennie, I've just got a question through you to the officers. In relation to this issue of council formulating a view on land sales and impact of the 1.75 in the next year. Number one, is that 1.75 related to laneways, and what percentage?
Thank you. I'll pass that question to Mr. Cochrane. We may have to take it on notice if we can't get an answer immediately.
Okay. So another question through the officers, just about which relates to this issue that's been raised by Councillor Sef's question. In the time frame that it's going to take us to adopt a, what are you calling it, a framework for land sales or land management, is the council due to consider any land sale of a strategic land that is not a laneway?
Okay, so we have two questions. The first related to... Oh, okay.
Through you, Mayor. So I'm not aware of any sales that are progressing at the moment. I am aware of purchases that don't involve laneways. Council is aware of purchases that don't involve laneways, but that's different. I'm not aware of any sales that are on foot at the moment that relate to anything other than laneways, and I'm not aware of any, and I'm looking at the officer hoping she'll nod to confirm that, so that she's just confirmed that. And At this point in time, I'm not aware of any major proposals, sort of strategic parcels or anything like that being proposed for sale, and certainly we would bring those through to council for discussion.
So my final question on this is to the CEO.
No, you address, your questions to the Mayor, and I will allocate
CEO.
them as I determine appropriate.
Is if council made a motion tonight, or an absence of a motion, that affected the sale of laneways and reserved itself to make a policy decision on the sale of larger strategic sites, does that interfere with operations? I mean, defer that until we have a framework.
To the Mayor.
To the Mayor. Does that actually have any administrative impact?
Ms Wilkinson.
Through you, Mayor, can I just clarify that the question is, in the event that council didn't proceed with establishing a property reserve this evening?
No. I'll just clarify it. So I'm trying to explore an option through this impasse. Fundamentally, if we passed a motion tonight, in whatever wording, that preserved the ability to sell laneways, but reserved our rights to make a final determination about larger strategic land until we have a framework, is that cause an operational or administrative problems?
I might remind all councillors that council cannot sell any parcel of land of any size without a decision of this chamber. So regardless of whether this amendment gets up or not tonight, council cannot sell any parcel of land of any size, whether it's a laneway or All Nations Park, without an amendment of council, a motion of council.
Madam Mayor, the purpose of my questions is to figure out possible amendments that are coming of both the substantive motion or whatever, and so that I can make a decision. And it relates to not whether this chamber sells or doesn't sell land, it relates to whether it's done within a strategic framework.
Okay, can I suggest we deal with this amendment first? Most councillors have spoken to this amendment at this point in time.
I'm sorry to prolong this, but I have one last question. Is 3A contradicts anything within the Local Government Act in terms of the powers that we are given through the Act? For example, if a resident comes to us and asks us to purchase a property, is there any process that we need to follow if they are the instigator of that versus us being willing to sell?
Who wants to?
Through you, Mayor. I think it's a good question, councillor, and I'd actually have to seek advice. My first response would be yes. I think the Local Government Act assumes that council will approach these things with an open mind, not a predetermined position. The effect of 3A as proposed via the amendment would be to change council's current policy position. So I'm clear that was what was intended, but this actually goes beyond what was proposed, which was a structure to hold funds. So this would be a policy change.
Councillor McCarthy.
I'm going to ask a question, Mayor, which may hopefully bring us to a close on this. If 3A had been approved prior to council being approached by the state government in relation to the Preston High site and council's involvement in that, would council have been able to engage in the sale of Preston High land to the state government for that purpose?
Councillor McCarthy, I remind you that we did not sell that land to the state government, so perhaps it may not be a useful example.
Okay.
Thank you. Can we return to this? A number of councillors have spoken. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken who wishes to speak to this amendment? No. So, okay. There being no further speakers, I'll put the amendment to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That amendment is lost, so we return to the motion.
Councillor Rennie, I'd like to propose an alternative, an amendment, please.
Sure.
That point 3 reads, and I'm happy for some help on this, defer the establishment of a property reserve to be considered when council endorses or when council considers the property management framework.
We'll just get some words in relation to that.
Yeah, if someone wants to say that better.
So could I...
I'll pass to Ms Wilkinson.
Through you, Mayor, Councillor, there's a couple of ways to achieve that. One is to remove section 3 altogether so that the motion is silent on it. The other would be perhaps it could be improved. Your suggestion could be improved by saying consider the establishment of a property reserve at the time rather than defers consideration of. So you're considering it as new.
Councillor Lassurf, I'll seek your advice as to which amendment or how you'd like the amendment.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that advice. So consider the establishment of a property reserve at the time when council considers the property management framework.
Yeah, and deletes.
And then delete
And then we'll
ABC.
delete the rest of the content that's now sitting.
Sorry, can that be considers?
Sorry,
the property-
Councillor Lawrence, I'll just get you to take your seat. Because we're just...
Sorry, council considers the property management framework? Yep.
That council considers the establishment of a property reserve at the time when council considers the...
Well, it's when the property management
Yeah.
framework comes to us.
Okay.
And deletes 3.
And then delete 3. So we'll make sure we have that because I will then ask whether that is acceptable. So just make sure we get the rest of the words in C deleted also. Okay, Councillor Lawrence, did you now have a question?
I was about to second this, but I'm not sure where we're at.
Okay, well, the first thing I'm
Go
going
to
to
the
do is
mover and second
actually
it.
ask the mover whether you will, that was Councillor Amir, do you accept this amendment? Yes. Councillor McCarthy, do you accept the amendment?
Enthusiastically so.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Lawrence, for your willingness to second, but that's actually not necessary because with the...
Question then.
Okay, so a question from Councillor Lawrence.
So my question in some ways is the same question I asked before. Will the effect of this 3 mean the 1.75 million in sales is not dedicated to a reserve?
Yes, that is what this will mean. But this is now the motion in front of us. So, so we'll now go into accumulated surplus. We've heard from Councillor Amir, Councillor McCarthy, Councillor Greco and Councillor Lawrence. Are there any further speakers to the substantive motion?
This is the substantive motion.
Yes, this is the substantive motion.
So we all can speak to the substantive motion.
No, you've already spoken,
No, I
Councillor...
spoke to my amendment, not to the substantive motion.
Councillor Greco spoke to... Okay, my apologies. Councillor Greco, would you like to speak to this motion?
Yes, I would. I have a further amendment that I'd like to propose to the substantive motion.
Sure.
And the amendment, and I'll need some assistance from our officers, and is that in relation to point number 3, that council consider the establishment of a property reserve at the time that council considers the property management framework with a view of ensuring that council does not endorse the privatisation of any real property owned by the council.
Is that acceptable to the mover? Do you have those words that you could pass to the officers, please, Councillor Greco? Is that acceptable to the seconder?
I'm not actually clear what the words are, sorry.
With a view of ensuring that council does not endorse.
It's a yes or no. It essentially picked up the words. Okay.
Sorry, Mayor, in order to make a determination, I'm not sure what the word privatisation means in this context.
Councillor McCarthy, if you're not sure, then you might consider not supporting it, or you could say yes or no, but it's a yes or a no.
Well, I would say no then.
Okay.
No.
Okay. That amendment has not been supported by the mover or seconder, so you'll need a seconder for that.
The amendment.
Is there a seconder for that amendment?
Madam Mayor, I'll second.
Mayor Rennie, thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Greco, you can speak to that. Can we just get
Thank
2
you,
minutes on
Mayor.
the clock, please?
Look, I've heard the debate and I thank Councillor Lesurf for omitting point 3 as it was originally established, and that we move down this path of establishing a property management framework. But in order to give that property management framework some sense of direction or intent, that's why I've moved this amendment to ensure that we build into that property framework proposal, or at least we consider as part of our deliberations, the intent of not privatising council land. And I think we owe it upon ourselves to do that and to move down that path. In relation to what councillors have been saying about laneways and things like that, I'm sure if there's a will on the council and in terms of stopping any privatisation of council land, that we can find a way around laneways or small pieces of land that may not be necessary to be held by council. I'm sure that we can find a way. We have the expertise in the council amongst our officers, and I think there's a 30, 40-year history in relation to the impact of privatisation and that it has had on the community in terms of understanding what it is, what it means, and how we can avoid the worst aspects of privatisation in terms of selling land that is publicly owned. The other point that I would make, so that if we pass this motion, we're not saying that we're going to stop privatisation from now, but what we're saying is that any future plan that we develop in regards to a property management framework will consider and include the stopping of any privatisation. The other point that needs to be made, councillors, and I think we've glossed over this, like open space, we have a policy that we want to increase open space. We don't want to diminish open space. And I think that's important given, as I said, we're a landlocked council. We can't create new land. We also need to make sure that we do not sell valuable and precious council property, that we need to increase the level of council properties that we have in order to service our community. So that's what I am intending to, if not increase, at least to maintain the essential the property that we have as a council for public use. And again, I repeat this, I stress this, and let's not make a mountain out of a molehill and just use little arguments to
10
say
seconds.
that, I'll finish on this, the laneways and things. I'm sure we can find a way around that, because I do not want to deny residents purchasing their little piece of laneway at the back of their street.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. That's time. Councillor Lawrence, would you like to speak to this?
Yes, Madam Mayor.
Mayor Rennie.
Mayor Rennie. So many years.
It'll come in time. Give it time.
I've got a few years of addressing mayors in that manner. Now, I think one of the things important to remember in the desire to maintain strategic land, large strategic land in public hands, is we're not a greenfield site, we're not a Wyndham or a Whittlesea. The land we have now is the chess pieces that we need to hang on to. And we don't need to go down the state government path of privatising public land. And one of the reasons is that we've had fairly aggressive development plans in Moreland and Darebin where we've given airspace to developers. So they can do the development now from Reservoir to Northcote. They can build skyscrapers just like 6-storey things all the way along there. They're not doing it because their market's not there yet. So we shouldn't be conned to ever privatise our car parks and bits and pieces because the private capital can go into those airspaces. They're private land already there. We need to encourage that consolidation of private land and that uptake. And we need to just hold what we've got, and we can have multiple uses for it. And as the issue of surplus laneways, I'm sure we can get into that policy debate. But my concern is really to have a hold position on all this strategic land and not get into the monopoly game. We've given them the air rights, those 6-storey zones and the 8-storey zones. They can play there. They can build private housing there.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Just for the sake of clarity, I might ask that the officers put back in black the first part of 3, which is now part of the substantive motion, so that the words "consider the establishment of a property reserve at a time that Council considers the property management framework" should be black, because that has been accepted. Thank you. Councillor Lasserf.
Look, all I want to say is that making this amendment a question of whether we want to privatise land or sell off land or whether we don't is actually really disingenuous. This is an item, a motion, that's about considering our financials and council plan. Yes, there was consideration of a property reserve, which we have now put back until the property management framework comes to us. But the debate that is happening within this amendment needs to happen when we consider that property management framework, and not now tacked on as a part of our quarterly reporting to the financials. So I cannot support this amendment.
Thank you, Councillor Lasserf. Councillor McCarthy.
I have a question, Mayor Rennie, which is if we can get an estimate of how many properties, pieces of land, parcels of land City of Darebin actually owns, if we can have an indication, or a rough percentage of how much of the City of Darebin landmass we own.
We're not able to
I suspect that would be the case, and that's fine. This whole debate is...
sorry, Councillor McCarthy, you're now speaking against the motion. We'll just get the time.
I feel a sense of Groundhog Day with this, because we have just gone through the process of articulating in this chamber that it is in this chamber where we make decisions about the sale or the purchase or the acquisition through other means of land and properties. That is where this happens. And every time council makes a decision on that basis, it takes into account what's at stake. And I want to posit to councillors a situation which could come before us, which would be completely negated or completely thrown up into dissolution by virtue of what Councillor Greco has proposed. Let's say for a moment that the state government was to say to us, you've got this little parcel of land here which is industrial land which you don't use other than to store some sheds on, and it has no community benefit. We would like that land, and in return we would like to give you a parcel of land 7 times the size, which is creek frontage, which currently is locked up. That is actually a real scenario right now, because there is a parcel of land which is Merry Creek frontage, owned and controlled by the Department of Health and Human Services, which is next to the Walker Street residence estate, which we would love to own. It is a strategic piece of environmental land for community use and for environmental restoration. Now, if the state government said, we actually don't want that land, but we would like this tiny little parcel here you're currently storing some tools and equipment on, and we say, well, we can actually store those things elsewhere, it has no direct community benefit, this proposal, from a policy perspective, would make that impossible. We'd be breaching our own proposed policy. So I think councillors need to get serious about the debate we're having here. This is not a debate about privatisation, and it is disingenuous for councillors to continue to frame...
Point of order, Mayor, if I may. Point of order.
What is the point of order?
The point of order, I think that my amendment has been misrepresented. we're referring to the sale, the scenario that's been presented refers to the giving of land to the state government. That is not exactly privatisation. Privatisation is when it's sold to private owners. So the scenario that Councillor McCarthy is presenting is, I think, misrepresenting my amendment.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor McCarthy, I'll ask that you clarify that you were... I would agree that Councillor Greco made it clear earlier that when he talked about privatisation, he was talking about land going into private hands, and that wouldn't be the case with a sale of land to the state government.
So, Mayor, I asked earlier, if I can just clarify, I asked for a definition of privatisation and wasn't able to get one.
I could give you an encyclopedia.
No, okay. I'm not going to enter into a debate. I think I've clarified that where.
I had 17 seconds on the clock when Councillor Greco interjected.
Okay.
So if I can finish my statement.
You have 17 seconds, Councillor McCarthy.
So the case is exactly the same if a private property owner, such as Salter, was to offer council the entire Preston Market footprint in return for the laneway that it wishes for its development. And this would actually say that we could not do that sale, that swap to secure the future of Preston Market.
That's time, Councillor McCarthy. Thank you.
You wouldn't buy it, Councillor.
Sorry. No, councillors,
Sorry,
I'll
could
ask
I
you to stop.
ask Councillor Greco to withdraw his remarks then, and also his reference to encyclopedia? I think that we all come here under the same code of conduct, and we need to conduct this debate with respect.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Lasserf. I think that's a good reminder to us that we were doing very well and having a respectful debate, and that's where we want this debate to stay. So I think it's important that we debate the issue, that we refrain from reflecting on the knowledge or otherwise or opinions of other people in a way that might denigrate or put them down. So we've had a number of speakers. I'll ask if anyone else wishes to speak to this amendment. Councillor Williams.
I just want to make a statement that that previous example was a very poor example because that was brought up from our previous council and we got nowhere in reference to exchanging land with the government. Now, I think that the issue here is not about little properties such as those who back up on laneways. I think it's about parcels of land that are difficult to decide on whether we sell them or not. And I think when we are looking at parcels of land that we want to sell that are quite substantial, that we really need to involve the community. It's not our land. It belongs to the community. We need to be having them engaged more when it comes to situations like that. Regarding land, there's only so much land that goes around. It's not like building where you can got airspace. We need to be really careful when we are purchasing and selling of land. It's easy to sell and yet so hard to gain land. And everybody who's ever played Monopoly, you would know exactly how it runs and how it is to actually win. It's those who have the most amount of property are the ones who end up winning in the end.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there further speakers to the amendment? There being no further speakers, I'll put the amendment to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That amendment is lost. That brings us back to the motion in front of us. Are there any further speakers on the motion? Councillor Lawrence, I understand you've already spoken to the motion.
Madam Mayor, I don't know if I've spoken. This is now the substantive motion?
No. I've been informed that you've already spoken to the motion.
I've spoken to amendments.
Just, I have some debate from officers, I confess with it. Okay, Councillor Lawrence, there is a doubt, but I'll give that benefit of the doubt to you and invite you to speak to the motion.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Mayor Rennie.
Mayor Rennie. I'm happy to support this motion with the amendment from Councillor Lasserf and welcome the rigorous debate that's already occurred and look forward to formulating and drilling down in this policy on the framework for managing property sales. In this limited space, we've been rather crude with the debate, but we need to develop a framework that is transparent, that the community understands we're not playing monopolies, we're not playing developer, that we are preserving public land that's strategic, not laneways, strategic public land for public use, and that does not preclude land swaps and cooperations with other authorities to achieve what? To achieve open space, to achieve low-income housing, to achieve benefits.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Are there any further speakers? There being none, I'll put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. That brings us to item 8.5 on the agenda, 6-month progress report for community advisory committees. Do I have a mover? Thank you, Councillor Amir. And a seconder? Councillor Newton. Councillor Amir.
I'll keep this brief given that it's already after 8:30. What we have here is the progress update for our many community advisory committees. Each of these committees involves community members, some of them with particular expertise, some of them representing their own communities, and along with a councillor. So you can see in the reports the major issues that were discussed. I've been a long advocate for thinking about ways that we can make best use of these committees, and I would like to see further reform so that we can make sure that people who are on the committees get the best outcome that they can and make the most of their skills and expertise. I also wanted to thank all the community members who've sat on these committees over the last 6 months and the officers who have supported them so that we can have this platform to hear from the people in Darebin.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. I'll keep it brief as well. I just want to point to one example from the advisory committees. So Councillor Mir and I are on the Sexuality, Sex and Gender Diversity Advisory Committee. And I think it was before our time, but one of those members came up with the idea for a trans and gender diverse swim night, which we were then able to put up to council to progress. And I think it's been one of the most meaningful things that I've certainly had happen in my time here. So I think that one example highlights the great things that the advisory committees can do, and I commend the report. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor. Look, I too would like to thank the various members of the committees that we have. It's a task that community members do voluntarily, and they provide us a lot of valuable information and insight and activism in relation to some of the issues that they're quite passionate about. And the only thing that I would note, reading through the various summaries of the committees, sometimes I don't think we actually do justice to all the work that they do, and I know that we don't want a 50-page report on what they do, but I just noticed that some of the reports, it was unclear to me, whether the committees actually met or didn't meet. I noticed that some committees did not meet and things like that. So I'm hoping that in future, in order to pay due diligence to the work that the committee makes, is that we can have a sort of a bit of a uniform approach in terms of how we report on the work of the advisory committee, so that it's clear to us and clear to the community in general about how often they meet and how many meetings they've had and some of the issues that they've covered. Some reports are very thorough. Some reports are a bit not as extensive as they should be. And the only other thing that I would suggest is that I notice that the committees often don't get any sense of appreciation or direct appreciation from council. So if I may add just a small amendment to point as a point 4, that we in some way acknowledge the work of the individual committee members. No use sending something to the chair, because the chair is usually a councillor, but sending something to the to the individual members of the advisory or the various advisory committees, just acknowledging that we've looked at their report. Thank you very much, and we look forward to you continuing to support.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. That's time. And thank you for that. Well, I was going to suggest that I could make a personal undertaking to follow that up, if you're happy with that undertaking, rather than putting it as an amendment. Okay, thank you. Are there any further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. That brings us to item 8.6 on the agenda, the Audit Committee membership. Councillor Lassurf. Oh, a seconder? Councillor McCarthy. Thank you.
I'll just wait for it to come up on screen. So this item is to appoint Mr Terry Richards to the Audit Committee until the end of this calendar year. The Audit Committee is an important committee for Council, and it is a requirement under the Local Government Act, and it provides assistance to Council in making sure that we fulfil our responsibilities in terms of financial management, risk management, internal controls and external reporting. Mr Richards has been a member of the Audit Committee for a few years now. He currently serves as the chair and was appointed the chair, I think, just over a year ago. And so what this motion proposes to do is to extend his appointment to the committee for the rest of the calendar year. There has been, I guess, a number of changes to council management over the last year or so, and so that we think that continuity in terms of membership of the Audit Committee is important at this point in time in helping council and monitor council's approach to financial management, risk and those sorts of things.
Thank you, Councillor Lassurf. Councillor McCarthy.
I have nothing to add.
Thank you. Are there any further speakers?
I have a question.
Yes, Councillor Greco.
I just noticed it now, and I'm just wondering from a governance perspective. I note that Mr Terry Richards' his appointment has already been extended, as per we exercised the option to extend his stay for a further 1 year, which was exercised on the 21st of August. And what we're proposing here, just to be clear, councillors, what we're proposing here is a further extension without advertising. Now, I'm just wondering whether that's appropriate or not appropriate, or we should have any concern about that or not.
Yep. Thank you, Councillor Greco. I'll pass that to Ms Bishop.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Mayor Rennie, under clause 3.2 of the Charter for the Audit Committee is where vacancies exist, Darebin City Council can determine a mechanism for filling those vacancies. So we've utilised that for the reasons that Councillor Lassurf referred to. So as far as governance goes, it is compliant.
Thank you, Ms Bishop. Are there any further speakers? No, there being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That is carried. That brings us to item 8.7, the Climate Emergency Darebin Committee membership. So a mover for that. Moved by Councillor McCarthy, seconded by Councillor Lassurf. Councillor McCarthy.
This is just a very minor report, but it's important that it goes through the proper channels. So as councillors would see, we have a situation where the terms of reference for CED, Climate Emergency Darebin, stipulate, like some other committees, that the Mayor will be the chair and automatically take on that role. We've had a different arrangement since the councillor appointments at the end of last year, which is that in this case, Councillor Lassurf is continuing as the chair, and I'm the second councillor on the Climate Emergency Darebin Advisory Committee, and Councillor Rennie, as the mayor, serves and is also very active, but serves in a sort of a proxy support role to that committee. So, sorry, got the words wrong there. So I apologise to Councillor Lassurf, who's shaking her head at me.
Non-voting member.
Non-voting member is the correct term. So this would simply formalise that arrangement, and nothing more than simply putting it in the official documentation, given what the terms of reference currently state.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Lassurf.
Nothing further.
No. Are there any further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? That motion is carried. That brings us to item 8.8 on the agenda, the Bundoora Homestead Board of Management.
With a slight amendment or an alternate motion.
Okay. If we could put up the motion proposed by Councillor Greco. Thank you, and seconded by Councillor Newton. Thank you. Councillor Greco.
Look, thank you, Mayor. Look, first I'll go to the substance of the report that is here before us. Here is a report from the Bundoora Homestead Board. It's basically covers 2 financial years, this report, and I must say that the report really gives us some good news. And I just want to cite a few things in terms of the work that's been done by the board in terms of promoting art in our city. And if you look at the report, you know, if you compare 2016-17 financial year visitations with the 2017-18 financial year visitations, in the previous year we had about 7,300 people that went through those doors. That doubled to over 15,000 visitations in the last financial year. It's a massive piece of work that's been conducted, and I must say that work has been done as a result of the council investing in the board. We gave $135,000 to the board based on the submission that they had put before us in terms of how they wanted to progress the homestead into the future, and I think we've already started to see some results. And also those results also reflect that, you know, moving from a 2.2 EFT number of staff to doubling that number of staff, you could see how we've also doubled the visitations. So I must commend the work of the board. Again, all volunteers, experts in their field, and also our council officers to provide the support for them. Also, what is actually should be noted in this report is also the quality of the exhibitions. The standard has really been lifted, and as we know, our homestead has received a museum status certification, which then can have quality exhibitions in the homestead, and that enables us then in turn to attract greater visitations and more people coming. Also, what's also of note, and some of the paintings are here in this chamber, is that we've had a few acquisitions that the board has undertaken, which actually adds to our stock of fine art that the Darebin Council has in its possession. So overall, a good effort, and that's why it comes to my last point there in terms of that I think we should write to the board to thank them for the work that they've done, and particularly their commitment and their foresight in moving the homestead forward. I think there'll be more advice coming to us in the future about how to
10 seconds.
Ramp up even further the work of the homestead in terms of have been a high quality exhibition space.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. Firstly, I'd like to thank Councillor Greco for adding this second point to this motion. I think it's very well deserved. This is a really wonderful board to be a part of. And reading these reports reminded me how far Bundoora Homestead has come in the 2 years that I've been on council. In our first year, we were able to give them what is really quite a small increase of funds in the scheme of things. But what it allowed them to do was, as Councillor Greco mentioned, was to move from 2.2 EFT to 4.8. And what we've seen there is we've got a wonderful curator, we've got a wonderful gallery manager and a wonderful board, which means that what's gone from being, I don't want to say lifeless, but it's really come alive in the last 2 years. So the last exhibition that I was at was Dapper. It was a beautiful night out in the garden. You know, people who I've never seen in that gallery before, I saw there on that night. And I was also reminded by seeing Cloud Street, so seeing a play at that Bundoora Homestead, which was really, really incredible. And I just wanted to point to the purpose of the homestead, which is something that we spent a lot of time working on in our board meetings. And it's this thing where they've combined what is probably one of the most colonial buildings that we own in Darebin with the diverse community as well. So it says, Bundoora Homestead Art Centre is where contemporary art and Australian history collide. A home for creative thinking, community participation and inventive contemporary art practice, where artists and audience are engaged, welcomed, challenged, and where they are empowered to contribute to a conversation about the issues of our time and place, all within a rich historical heritage. And I think they're well on the way to achieving that. The other really wonderful thing that you see in the annual reports is that
10 seconds.
We're now getting partnerships with the state government, and I really want to commend the board and the staff for all their work.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Are there further speakers? No? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is carried. 8.9, the Public Art Framework. Councillor Newton. And a seconder? Councillor Amir. Thank you. Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So the motion that we have in front of us is that Council adopts the Public Art Framework overview. So what I'm always pleased by when I read these reports is the way that our Arts and Culture Department is just becoming more and more strategic, the way they're becoming more and more looking at the whole city about what we need in terms of art. I think this is a really, really broad, overarching strategy that will put us in the right position for public art. They focus on temporary art and permanent art, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that they speak about in particular, which is that people are really keen to see temporary art. They're excited to see more public art in Darebin, and they want to see more artists creating public art in Darebin. And they believe public art in Darebin can make the community more inspiring and surprising. So this report has really responded to that by talking about things like having artist residencies and to have infrastructure for temporary art such as screens, light boxes and projectors. And I also just wanted to highlight that there's the idea to set up a rolling reserve to accumulate funds for more significant permanent artworks commissioned by council. I know that FIDO was sort of a start, and I think that we can go much further than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Councillor Amir.
I just have a question, if I may.
Yes, Councillor Greco.
Just in relation to on page 254, in regards to the other stakeholders engaged, I note, for example, that the Darebin Ethnic Communities Council was not consulted. I also note, for example, I would have thought that Multicultural Arts Victoria would have been consulted. Also, schools and other organisations, local organisations, were not consulted. Could I just have the reason why that was not done, or whether that was an omission?
Thank you, Councillor Greco. I'll ask Ms Henderson to respond to that.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, I apologise, I don't have the answer on that with me. I'm not certain how those groups were engaged. And the consultation principally actually happened in 2017. So I'm sorry I can't comment on that, but I can provide that information to councillors at a later date.
Thank you, Ms Henderson.
I have a further question, just in relation to, again, on page 253, in regards to consultation. It talks about the survey attracted 174 respondents. I'd just like to get some information, just in order to understand who responded to the survey and what was the broad range of commentary that was received. I know that some commentary is there, but I was more interested about who actually responded to the survey.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Ms Henderson, are you in a position to shed any light on that?
Through you, Mayor Rennie, the report does set out some information about who responded, as the councillor refers, and part of what they said, but for further information and detail, I'd need to give that to you on notice.
Thank you. I was about to get the seconder to speak to that motion, which was Councillor Amir.
Thanks, Mayor Rennie. So what we see in this report is a plan laid out for public art in Darebin based on what we've heard from the community. And as was mentioned by Councillor Newton, our community is really interested in seeing, well, certainly values public art and is particularly interested in seeing more temporary and ephemeral art. One thing that really struck me about this report was and the approach is the emphasis on contemporary ideas, really grounding art in Darebin and supporting the kinds of works and projects that couldn't happen anywhere else. Also, there's a strong emphasis on artist-led projects, whether it's commissions or working with community, and really valuing the skills and expertise of the artists we have here in Darebin. I was previously on the Arts Ambassadors Committee, and one thing I really learned from speaking to people on that committee and understood was that to support art, we need to support artists. It's not enough just to have one-off grants or to have, expect people to create art in a vacuum. We need to be supporting the whole ecosystem, and I think that's something that I can see embedded in the plan here. We know that art brings life to the communities, to physical spaces. People talk about the want to be inspired, and I'm proud and excited that we've got here sets out for that provocative, inspiring, contemporary approach. I think we enjoy as a council being a bit provocative sometimes, and so it's exciting to see that reflected in this public arts plan and to provide the opportunities for artists to put their views forward and be a bit provocative too.
Thank you, Councillor Amir. Councillor Williams.
I'd like to put in a deferral in reference to this framework overview to actually do further consultation.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. I'll just find out what the process is in relation to that.
I have an amendment.
It wouldn't be an amendment because it's actually in opposition to what's before us. Councillor Williams, we're going to effectively need to have the debate on the motion that's in front of us. If that motion is not successful, then obviously you could put forward an alternate motion at that point. So you've foreshadowed an alternate motion if that's not successful. Thank you. And that's because it can't be considered an amendment because it's actually opposite.
Yeah, no, I'd like to speak against this, even though the report is fantastic and what the officers have done is absolutely quite elaborate, and I do applaud their work. However, I believe that we need to be looking at our arts program in a direction that should be 100% community-based artwork, not public art from the people outside of Darebin. I want the community to be more involved, and those that are involved in murals, not professional artists that have been paid a large amount, that are not living in Darebin and sometimes are living interstate. I want to involve other key stakeholders like schools, including the disability action groups, the community groups like Active and Ageing, DEC and sporting clubs. Darebin has more artists, singers, writers than any other municipality. We should be 100% local. We need to be the economic development tool for our artists in our community, the cultural development for our community, the economic development for our artists. It is quite clear on principle that not $1 of our taxpayers' money should be spent on non-local art. Our art budget needs to promote our local artists. We need to redesign this. We need to be leaders and ensuring that our community is involved in the beautification of this city, which I believe this framework does not involve our local community people enough.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there further speakers? Councillor McCarthy.
Councillor Lawrence is waiting.
I was going to ask a question.
Certainly, Councillor Lawrence.
Mayor Rennie, I was trying to understand the survey results in page 253, and I wanted to ask, was there any questions there, I suppose, that differentiated between community art and public art, or the preference for local artists versus non-local artists? I can't see it, but maybe there was other questions.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. I'll refer that to Ms Henderson, but also remind councillors that there was a written briefing that came to council a short time ago which may have covered some of these items. So, Ms Henderson.
Through you, Mayor Rennie, if you look at the Public Art in Darebin framework on page 2 of it, which is page 258, it talks about a commitment that public art would be led or created by experienced professional artists, often, I would think, always working with the community locally. This doesn't set out a requirement that such artists be from Darebin, but it does set out a requirement that public art reflect the community and not be plonk art, but work with the community on its visions and aspirations. In terms of the notion of community art versus professional art, I think the way that this framework conceives that is that the best outcomes for the community will come through the involvement of a professional artist who often will be from Darebin, but sometimes might not be. And for instance, there are times when you might look for particular artists, such as an artist from the Aboriginal community, and it might be necessary to go to a broader pool than the amazing pool of Darebin artists that we have.
Thank you, Ms Henderson. Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Lawrence, if you want to speak, I'll come back to you, but I saw Councillor McCarthy's hand first.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to elevate the conversation to where we are in the context of Darebin's public art story, which is that we actually have a fantastic story of public art in this city, and we have some incredible projects which are not just known locally, but are known much more broadly, in fact, in some cases, both nationally and internationally. I would draw Councillors' attention back to the Curie mural on St George's Road, known as the Northcote mural, the Northcote Curie mural. It's comes under a number of names. As councillors may be aware, and some in our community may recall, this mural, which of course depicts a whole series of significant moments in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, some of which occurred very close, in fact, to where we are standing right now, and some obviously also in Victoria and other parts of the country, was a project that was actually undertaken through the guidance of a couple of professional artists who worked in community contexts, but involved students and young people living in this community. And from my perspective, that is what this public art framework does, is that it honours those sorts of practices. It says that there is a role for that facilitated type of art that involves professional artists, teachers in some cases as well. In this case, it was people working in local contexts with local young people and local other artists who created that extraordinary work that we actually restored only a few years ago and will continue to do so. We've done the same thing with other significant murals in this city. So when we talk about a public art framework, and it is very clearly articulated in this document, we are talking about a whole range of things. Sometimes it is the artists working on their own, other times it is working with a range of people in the community. What this is about, though, is about safeguarding the processes through which we do this sort of work. There has been a lot of thought and investigation into this, and I think we need to honour that work by getting on and adopting this. We will review it again at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Are there further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
Mayor Rennie, I'd like to speak against the motion, having heard the foreshadowed alternative motion. I think it's worth stretching a bit further on this policy. I need to declare I was part of what was called the community art movement in the 80s and 90s, and the mural referred to, the Northcote mural, was part of that movement, just as was the mural down on Smith Street in Clifton Hill, which depicted a range of migrant and workers, women, in a mural. And the community art movement developed, and yes, you can say there was professional artists involved in it, but there was a specific methodology which wasn't simply what has become the public art movement, which might be a professional private sculptor who creates like the beautiful eggs in Darebin Parklands. So at my point on this, the localisation of it in terms of community participation to me isn't delineated enough. And also, I think we haven't had this proper debate about whether we define
some methodologies of community art that are fairly distinct from simply taking private art and scaling it up and placing it in a public context. And this is really about fine-tuning and extending that, because we could actually delineate ourselves away from the elitist notion that culturalist suburbs get visitations by award-winning artists, and instead
10
focus
seconds.
on the creation of community-based artists, both by our local artist community and by our actual community, who could be
That's
students
time. Thanks, Councillor
and
Lawrence.
who could be future professional artists.
Are there any further speakers? Councillor Greco.
I just seeking a clarification first. I understand that this did come to a council briefing.
As an information only, which, yep.
So
yes, it did.
Only as an information only.
There was a written paper that came to a council briefing a few weeks ago.
It was not discussed at the briefing?
No, that's correct, because no councillors asked any questions relating to the matter, but it was there. Okay.
Right.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Yep.
Okay, look, I was going to pose a question also to the mover and the seconder. And again, I just make an appeal to them, is that it's important what we're considering. I just asked them, because of the mechanics of the...
This is counting as your...
Is that whether they would withdraw moving and seconding this report and consider
Councillor Greco,
deferring it.
this is your time for speaking. I think the mover and seconder have moved and seconded. So
I'll put a question through you. If you could put that question to
no, I'm
the
not
mover
going
and the seconder.
I'm not going to put that question. You have an opportunity to use your 2 minutes to debate it. In the course of your debate, you can stipulate why you believe it should be deferred. So we'll start again, but this is your 2 minutes to speak against the motion that's been put, if that's what you wish to do.
Yeah. Look, I'm disappointed in that. I'm just trying to find a way through, so I'm disappointed in the decision that you've just made. Look, councillors, I just question the methodology that we've applied in coming to this framework document. Is that there's a big debate in the art community around community art versus professional art. This report here, I think, is weighted too much towards professional artists. I don't discount professional artists at all, far from it. But if we want a truly participatory, a truly representative form of art that in our city, that we give voice to that, I don't think the methodology that we've gone through, and that's why I asked the question at the outset, is that not all the relevant groups, I believe, were consulted. And as a result of that, this has been weighted way towards the industry or the professionals taking a charge on this particular art, and then directing the rest of us about what sort of art would be good for our community or not. Of course, they will involve the community and in relation to developing particular projects. But if we are to be really sincere about the methodology, we should have had that methodology at the outset, where the community, in a broad sense, was actually consulted. We haven't done that, councillors, and I think that affects the whole tone of this strategy or this framework that we are considering and putting in place. So on that basis, and also because of the lack of information that we have from our officers in terms of the questions that I've asked, it just becomes, I'm not sure how we actually can decide about, make an informed decision in relation to this, and as a result, I won't be supporting this and hoping that the council would defer it.
Thank you,
so we could have a
Councillor
thorough
Greco.
discussion.
That's time. Are there any further speakers? No? I'll give a right of reply to Councillor Newton.
Thank you, Mayor Rennie. So what I'm hearing from Councillor Greco and Councillor Lawrence is the idea that there's a separation between award-winning professional artists and community art. So, Councillor Williams, for example, you talked about wanting 100% community art, but then you also mentioned how Darebin has a huge amount of artists and writers.
Through the Mayor.
Yeah,
sorry,
sure.
but,
No problem. But I think what that doesn't recognise is that there's plenty of award-winning professional artists from within Darebin as well and beyond. And they should be getting paid for their work. And we just passed a resolution before to support the annual reports of the Bundoora Homestead Art Centre. We talked about how much that's been uplifted in the last 2 years by the money that we've supported them through, having their particular specialist curators who've really lifted the standard of art there. And I think what this motion is about doing something similar for the whole city, which is having a public art framework that uplifts the standard of art in the city. And that doesn't take away from community art. For example, we're currently looking at a graffiti management strategy that includes things like a street art mural subsidy program. So it says this subsidy program is an innovative project that aims to brighten the streetscape and prevent the reoccurrence of illegal graffiti and tagging through the provision of quality street art on locations previously subjected to graffiti. I understand it's already been successful in the locations that we've used already. The city is being beautified in really different ways to what we've seen before. And I reject the idea that you can't have community art and award-winning professional artists from Darebin.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. The debate is now closed, so I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion...
Can I have my name noted as voted against?
Yes. Councillor Williams has noted that her opposition to the motion be recorded. That brings us to item 8.10 on the agenda, proposed sale of land at the rear of 28K Hughes Parade.
I'm happy to move that.
Thank you, Councillor Greco, and seconded by Councillor Newton. Councillor Greco.
This is one of those sale of laneways, as we talked a lot about before. It's not the sort of thing that we actually want to stop, but it's the... So it's one of those cases that's come before us. It's going through the ordinary process. I think that the main points that need to be considered when we're reviewing these is that the sale of land, that there were no submissions received, in relation to this particular sale of a laneway, and that the owners at the adjoining property at 3K Morris Street Reservoir have not objected nor expressed any interest in the land, and as a result, the land has been sold at market value, as well as meeting all the reasonable costs associated with the sale of the land. So, on the basis of that, I support the recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Newton?
Nothing further to add.
Thank you. I'll put that to... Oh, any further speakers? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That is carried. Item 8.11, proposed sale of land adjoining the rear of 18 Livingston Street and 15A Nocton.
I'll move that again.
Thank you, Councillor Greco, and seconded by Councillor Newton. Councillor Greco.
Again, this is a very similar case to the previous one I just mentioned. I think it should be underlined for the sake of the record that no submissions were received in regards to the proposed sale of the adjoining land at the rear of 18 Livingston Street. And also what's worthy to note is that the owners of the adjoining property at 15A Nocton Street withdrew their interest at a later date, even though initially they had expressed some interest in buying the land, which would have taken it down another course in terms of who actually would have ultimately got the land. But given that one party has withdrawn, then the immediate adjoining owner, and given that there were no objections, I support the recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Newton?
Nothing further.
Are there any further speakers? I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. That motion is carried. That brings us to item 8.12, free exercise in the park.
I'll move that with an alternative motion.
Okay, and we'll just get your motion up on screen. No, I think that's not it. We're just waiting for... okay. Thank you, Councillor Greco.
Thank you, Mayor.
And that's, sorry, just to confirm, that's seconded by Councillor Lasserf.
Look, it's pretty straightforward. Basically, it's a deferral motion because I've had a look at this report quite thoroughly. Why is that this report comes from a motion that I had put to the council. I think there are slightly some errors in this report. For example, that the Exercise in the Park program, it didn't, from my knowledge, it didn't commence in 15-16. It goes way further back than that, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And it goes back to that time when it didn't even cost $93,000. It only cost about $15,000. So there's that. Also, I've been able to ascertain that you know, some of the information that is in this report, it just does not reflect what my understanding is of what's happened out there. And as a result of that, I believe that we should defer the report and also for us then to consider it at a briefing and to actually to consider a wider range of options than the options that have been provided here. And just to give you an example, in relation to the Walker Street, there's reference to the Walker Street in terms of the public housing estate. My understanding is that Walker Street was quite successful. Started off with about 8 people and then ended up with about 18 people. And actually one of the problems was that it became too crowded. So what I read in the report here is actually almost suggesting that, you know, we tried it, it didn't really work and we should sort of move on to other formulas. So there are issues like that I don't think that this report is really rigorous enough in terms of actually giving us a really good fix on free exercise in the park. The other thing too that I think we need to consider as part of our, if we defer this, is that the original intent of free exercise in the park was to make it attractive to people who could not afford to get a gym subscription. So if they can't go to the gym, we'll bring the gym to them in a sense, yeah? But what's happened in recent years, I think, is that the ones that participate in this are not the ones that it was originally targeted for, and that the options that are given here in this report do not reflect how we could make it better attractive or better suited to people who cannot participate in sport because of socioeconomic reasons and other reasons. And we know that in Darebin, the participation rates of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds is far much lower than what it is in the state average. So look, I would really urge councillors to defer it because, you know, one could be cynical here and say $93,000 for
10 seconds,
500
Councillor.
to 600 attendants, where they're paying $50 a head, you may as well give them a free subscription to the gym if you had to do that. So what's been suggested...
Thank you,
has
Councillor
not
Greco.
been
That's
thought
time.
through thoroughly enough. So I really ask councillors, let's defer it and let's have a thorough discussion in order to bring the ideas behind this to a conclusion.
Thank you, Councillor Greco. Councillor Lasserf.
I don't have much to add to Councillor Greco's comments, but just to say that I have also heard from workers within our community, particularly around the Walker Street estate and how successful that program was, and that location actually is everything in those people participating in these sorts of classes. And that perhaps something else that we need to consider is, while we do have undertaken a survey, got a good results in terms of number of people that participated in the survey, I would be really interested to understand the socioeconomic status of a lot of these people. Are these the people that we need to be providing this service to? There were 85% of people who indicated what they most enjoyed about it was it was free. But do they actually have the money, or could they actually afford to participate in other programs like yoga that is offered by our neighbourhood houses at a very low cost anyway? I'm very happy to support Councillor Greco's motion to defer this so that we can explore this further.
Thank you, Councillor Lasserf. Are there any further speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
Yes, Madam Mayor, I'd just like to speak in favour of the deferral just so that we can look at if there's any synergies. I understand always staff and people are talking to me about how to expand the exercise programs that are at our swim centres, and I'm mindful that both swim centres are next to parks. also. So there is a question about effectiveness and not disputing the benefits of the people here, but whether or not developing a program that leverages off staff presences we already have and developing a program that is actually connected to free healthcare member subscriptions. Because when we have been successful with the neighbourhood house in Reservoir, with uptake of exercise, it came with free introduction, 3 months introductions and things like that. So there's a question there of whether we can leverage more participation at the targeted income levels using a combination of locations and obviously leveraging off present staff, current staff levels.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Williams.
I also would like to have this deferred, as I really believe that increasing social inclusion, which is people that need to be included, and we need to start looking at raising the wellbeing of the community. We need to be tackling the disadvantage in our community and to include concessional residents and those living in Housing Commission estates. Especially, it is these people who have a higher level of being disadvantaged with more mental health issues than those who are not disadvantaged. So I think it's important that we continually look at those and see what we could do to further enhance their quality of life by giving them free exercise in the park where they're able to have access to, rather than going at such a distance to be getting access to this free exercise.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Are there any further speakers? There being none, I'll put this to the vote. All those in favour? And against? That motion is carried. That brings us to item 8.13 on the agenda, contract number CT 20188. Councillor Lasserve.
Happy to move that with, I'll read it out. Awards contract number CT 20188 for the provision of internal audit services to HLB Man Judd Vic Pty Ltd for a period of 3 years with an option for 2 one-year extensions for a total contract sum of $773,160, GST inclusive. Approves a contingency amount of $77,316, inclusive of GST, being 10% of the contract amount, and the rest of it is up there.
Okay, thank you. While we're getting that information in, I'll ask for a seconder. Councillor McCarthy, thank you. Councillor Lasserve.
So this motion is to appoint an internal audit services. The appointment of an internal auditor will assist Council and the Audit Committee to manage our risks and to come in and really take a good look at how we're going against implementing our policy and procedures and give us advice on how we can do things better. And so they really do provide an important service to Council to provide that oversight. This contract will go for 3 years with the option to extend. The process that was followed was a competitive process with quite a number of responses, which was good to see in terms of the competitiveness, and went through a tender evaluation, full tender evaluation within the organisation to come up with their recommended supplier for this contract. The recommended supplier do have a long history of providing this type of services to not just to the local government sector but to other sectors, and so they are very well placed to advise us of this.
Thank you, Councillor Lasserve. Councillor McCarthy.
I don't have anything to add, Mayor.
Thank you. Any further speakers? There being none, I'll put that to the vote. All those in favour? Thank you. That motion is carried. That brings us to the end of the reports. So we're now at consideration of responses to petitions, notices of motion and general business. There are none. 10, notices of motion. There are none. 11, reports of standing committees. There are none. And 12, records of assemblies of councillors. Moved by Councillor McCarthy and seconded by Councillor Greco. Thank you. All those in favour? That is carried. Reports by Mayor and Councillors. Moved by Councillor Lasserve, seconded by Councillor Williams. All those in favour? That motion is carried. Consideration of reports considered confidential. There are none. That brings us to the close of the meeting. Thank you, everyone. Thank you particularly to Mr Coffey for making it the whole way through.
No medal, not even a cup of tea.
Thank you, councillors, and thank you to the officers.